Good morning. This is Susan Wilhelm of the California Energy Commission. I'd like to thank Nancy Thomas and the Geospatial Innovation Facility, who's responsible for the development of CalAdapt 2.0, to this workshop, which they're hosting in Sacramento. Before I hand over the controls, I need to do a few housekeeping items. We are being recorded, so we're being recorded. For those of you who are not familiar with the building, the closest restrooms are located out these doors and then hang a right. They'll be on your right. There's a snack bar on the second floor under the white awning, and if we have an emergency and the building is evacuated, please follow me and Yuho out the exit. We know where we're going, and we'll go to the farmer's market on that corner. We'll reconvene at Roosevelt Park, where there's a beautiful farmer's market on Tuesdays. And please proceed calmly and quickly following us. Thank you. And I'd like to hand it over now to Nancy Thomas of the Geospatial Innovation Facility. I didn't really mean to say that. Okay.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you, Susan. We will get started. Thanks to everybody for coming today, and thanks to all the people who are listening in on WebEx. We're really excited about this. This is a great opportunity for us to get feedback on all the tools we've been building. So we're really excited about sharing CalAdapt 2.0 with you and hearing your feedback about what you think about it. So I want to just start a little bit with some introductions and some acknowledgments of all the people who have worked so hard to make CalAdapt possible. So CalAdapt is really a tool for energy sector resilience and research, and it's been developed at UC Berkeley's Geospatial Innovation Facility. So we started developing CalAdapt with the original version in 2011, and the development of CalAdapt has always been supported by the California Energy Commission. So we'd like to thank them for their oversight and guidance as well. And we do have several people who have worked really hard on CalAdapt here in the room with us. So I would like to just say hello and introduce a couple people. I'm Nancy Thomas, and I'm the Executive Director of the Geospatial Innovation Facility. I'd like to introduce Shruti Mukhtiar. Shruti, maybe you can raise your hand. Shruti is our lead web developer on CalAdapt. She really does all the beautiful data visualization. And Brian Daly is our senior web developer at the GIF, and Brian does a lot of the back end. He's really built the architecture of the site. So it's their hard work that's made it really a great product. I'd also like to introduce our colleagues at the energy sector. So Susan Wilhelm is with the Energy Generation Research Office. And of course, Guido Franco, who's really led the development and oversight of CalAdapt. So thank you for coming today. We also have Sonia Giu in the room. Did I pronounce it wrong? I'm sorry. Sonia's going to be helping out also with some of the breakout sessions today, so thank you so much for that help. David Stoms is also going to be helping out with with the breakout sessions today, and Yuhu, who's also going to be working with the breakout sessions. So thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. I got your name wrong too, huh? Sorry about that. Well, thank you all for coming. We are really excited about it today. And of course, we've had a lot of other oversight and guidance on CalAdapt over the years. Certainly our technical advisory committee has been very helpful, both the past and present members of that. And of course, the data sets, all of the great data sets that we are working with on CalAdapt were created by many different partners and different research institutions. So we want to thank them as well. So I just want to go over the agenda really quickly. Well, our goal today is to introduce everybody to the new features and new tools within CalAdapt 2.0. So I will do a little introduction, and then I'll do a live demo of the website so everybody can see what the new stuff is. And then we're really interested in getting your feedback. We're going to have Susan Wilhelm will do a little bit of user stories. So she's going to show you how CalAdapt has been used by people in the energy sector. So a couple of case studies. And then we're going to jump into getting feedback from people. So we really are interested in learning, you know, how does the site work right now? Are you able to do the things that you need to do? And we're really interested in hearing more from you about new tools or new visualizations that would really help the energy sector to do its job. So we're interested in hearing what your ideas are for how we could improve CalAdapt. We will wrap up. We'll report back from our focus group where we're really going to try to get feedback on specific tools. We will all come back here, report back, and wrap up by noon. I think most of you know that there is an afternoon session as well on the Adaptation Clearinghouse. So we'll end this at noon. We'll go and have a quick lunch, and then we'll come back at 1 and go through the Adaptation Clearinghouse. So just a little bit more about CalAdapt. I think a lot of you are familiar with CalAdapt, certainly the original version. And what we're really doing with CalAdapt is a tool that includes, rigorous scientific data on climate change science and makes that scientific data actionable at the local level, specifically for energy sector needs. So our guiding principles at CalAdapt has always been to convey local climate risks. And again, we use rigorous scientific data within all of the visualization and tools in CalAdapt. So it's important to really be using the latest, greatest peer-reviewed science on our tools. We try to make everything easy to understand so that even complicated climate change projection information is easily understandable by a wide audience. We use interactive maps and charts so people can really dive into the data and learn about what they're interested in looking at. We allow access to the primary climate change data. So a lot of our users are actually scientists who come to CalAdapt and download the actual data sets, and then they can do their own analysis on them. And something that we're really working on now with CalAdapt 2.0 is enabling people to develop their own custom tools. So we obviously can't create every possible tool out there, so we do allow people to access the data sets and create their own tools on top of that. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So those are all our guiding principles. As I mentioned, we are really here to introduce CalAdapt 2.0. We're really excited about this. We launched this version of CalAdapt in August, and we're really interested in showing you what the new features are and getting your feedback on it. So I'm going to start just a little bit with some of the enhancements. The original CalAdapt was first launched in 2011, and since then there have been a number of different new factors that we needed to work with to create a new website. So CalAdapt 2.0, probably the biggest difference is that there's much more high-resolution data. So we're including higher resolution, higher fidelity data sets within CalAdapt 2.0. One of the main data sets that we're using is the temperature and precipitation that's been created at a daily time step. That's downscaled LOCA, localized climate analogs, downscaled CMIP5 data, and that's created at script. So that data is a higher resolution than our previous data sets. It's 1/16th degree, approximately 6 kilometers by 6 kilometers. And we have many other new data sets as well, which are higher resolution than what we had before. We have some inundation data created by Dr. John Radke. We have observed historical data, wildfire data created by Leroy at University of Merced, and many other data sets as well, which are higher resolution. A little bit more, we also have enhanced data visualizations on here. So we've done a lot to really make the tools easier for people to use. So we include, one of the things that people have asked about is including different boundary layers. So we can use, we actually have preloaded boundary layers that people can use to aggregate their data, which is really helpful. Something new that we've also done is that users can upload their own shapefiles. So if you have a region of interest that you want to look at that's not in one of our standard tools, we can load it in and you can use your own data set. So that's a really nice feature as well. A couple of these other things, slider tools and the ability to print charts, we're going to show live. So we'll talk about that soon. We also have improved the access to data. So, there's a lot of different climate data out there, and I know a lot of different people want to use it in different formats. So we've allowed access to the data in a wide variety of formats. One thing that users can do is download the actual charts themselves into the visualizations into a PNG file. So if you want to look at just an image, which you can then put into a report, that's something that's really easy to do. You can also download data as a CSV file. So if you want to use this information in a spreadsheet, you can do that as well. For some of the more advanced users or people who are doing more with geospatial data, we have GeoTIFF as a format for many of the selected tools. And then we also have primary NetCDF data. So many of the data sets are available in NetCDF for scientists who want to graph the data and do their own research with it. We actually have much more data available in NetCDF than we have data visualization tools for. So you can download all 32 CMIP5 models for 2 RCP scenarios. You can also download all of the VIC modeled variables in NetCDF format through CalAdapt. And then we also have a new public API, which is created for custom tool development, which I will talk a little bit more about. So this is something really exciting that's new with version 2.0. So we have built an open source application programming interface for CalAdapt. This is probably a little more than you want to see, but this is really our open source web architecture that the site is built around, all built at the GIF. We have developed our own spatial data sources or spatial libraries to work with temporal aggregation of data and allows us to do the spatial aggregation by different boundary layers. But the really great thing about the API is that other organizations can access the data without downloading it and use it in their own application. So that really makes it very powerful. Again, you know, we can do as many tools as we can, but we can't build tools for everybody or for all local applications. So with the API, you can just go and grab whatever climate data sets for your region of interest that you want to work with and put that into your own application. So that makes it really freely available for a very wide audience. So that's something really exciting. So just a little bit about how CalAdapt supports the energy sector work. We do that in a number of different ways. As I mentioned first, you know, we are serving all of these rigorous peer-reviewed scientific data sets. One of the things that's really important that we've done with CalAdapt is we default to the recommended scenarios for California. I'll show you that in just a minute. But we have scenarios that are aligned with recommendations for the energy sector as well as for the fourth assessment research portfolio. So that allows cross-integration of results. We also provide resources and outreach, so things like this workshop and doing webinars around training people to use CalAdapt. We will develop specific tools for the energy sector and again allow development of tools through that API. So that's pretty cool. We also do, of course, our data visualization. So really a lot of people know CalAdapt through some of the great data visualizations that we share that, again, can communicate these complex results in ways that are easy to understand and easy to use. So a little bit more about the recommended scenarios. So there are, you know, there's many, many different climate change models out there, as most of us are aware. In fact, there's 32 of them that have been downscaled for California. Now, once you start working with that many climate models, it gets really confusing. You don't really know where to start, which one to use. So what we have done, we are showing on CalAdapt the models that California has determined are the top priority models. So I think it was DWR work that selected the initial 10 models, which is something that you can choose on most of our visualization tools. And out of those 10 models, 4 models were specified as being the best ones or the priority models for different research groups to work with. And these are the defaults on all of our CalAdapt tools. So that's something that has been really requested by a lot of people. There's so much climate change information out there, you sort of need to get a handle on it in some way. So having these 4 models to really start with is a really important way to make it easier to use rigorous climate change science. So with that, I am going to do a demo. I can only talk about it so much. It's much better to look at it and see how it looks on screen. Let me just set this up. Okay, so it's always a little nerve-wracking to do a live demo, but it should work. So what we're just going to do is go to caladapt.org, cal-adapt.org, and this is the landing page of our new site. And we're just going to jump into showing some of these different tools. As you can see, we have tools around annual averages. We have snowpack, sea level rise, wildfire. We're just going to go up to the top and start with our annual averages tool. So what we see when we go to each of these tools is some general information about it and our data visualization. So this tool is defaulting to a grid cell outside of Sacramento. So that's what our default location is. So a couple things about this tool. We're looking at maximum temperature for that particular grid cell. We are looking at this gray line, if you can see that, is the actual observed historic climate data. So that's our actual observations. And the colored lines are our projected LOCA climate data. One thing that you notice is this gray boundary, the gray envelope. The gray envelope is actually showing us the range of values from all of the 32 modeled data sets. So that's showing our entire range of variability. So we call that the envelope of variability for all of the different data sets. So that's a nice thing to see. As opposed to just trying to focus on individual models, we can sort of see what that range is. And as we can see, it's a very wide range. We can scroll down and look at different models. So here are the 10 climate models that I mentioned. And as you'll see, those 4 recommended models are the ones that are defaulted to. But you can also add or subtract. You can click on these to add more models, and the chart will update with that information. So we have a quick stats tool. So what this is showing us is the annual mean for the historic time period, and then it's also showing us the annual mean for end of century based on the climate model we chose, the climate models we chose. We can also change the emission scenario. So right now we're looking at RCP 4.5, where emissions peak around 2040 and then decline. We can also look at RCP 8.5. You'll see that the data updates as we select different things. And we can also see how the mean changes. So what we're projected to see with RCP 8.5 is more around 82.7 degrees. So a couple other things we can do. Within each of these tools, we can download the data as CSV. I mentioned before that that's a way that a lot of people have been interested in looking at the data. So you could just download that and use it in your own application. You can also save the chart. So each of these charts you can save out as an image file, and then you could easily input that into a report or something else. And you'll see that that has all the information on it, including the data sets that you're using. So we will jump into a few other tools and learn more about it as we go along. Let's start by also looking at this precipitation. So again, we have these annual averages for max, minimum temperature, and precipitation. So precipitation is interesting. We all know that precipitation in California is extremely variable, and we know that with projected climate change, it is actually still going to continue to be quite variable. In fact, in some areas, some models actually are projecting higher precipitation. So a couple other things to explore here. One thing that we can do within all of these tools is change our location, of course. So I could continue to look at individual grid cells, or I can use one of these aggregation boundary layers. So all of these layers are defaults in CalAdapt, and you can select any of them that you're interested in. So watersheds, climate zones, counties, and a couple of these planning areas as well. We are going to start and look at an area in Truckee. The Truckee-Donner Public Utilities District. So in order to use these boundaries, I just select the one I want, and then I find my area, and I click on it, and then I go to Update Chart. So this is now automatically updating all of my charts for that region that I'm interested in looking at. So again, it's averaging the data over that area. And again, it'll do whichever models I'm interested in looking at. So with this tool, we are able to see what the average precipitation is projected to be. So we can see that for our historical period, it was around 32.7 inches annually. And we're actually projected with these particular models to get an increase in precipitation in the future. Again, we can look at individual models if we're interested, so we can just select individual models. So we see that some of these models are basically showing an average of the same temperature or the same precipitation in the future, and some are actually showing increase. So I know that in the Truckee area, you know, when it was so wet this winter, there were a lot of problems with flooding and power outages. So it's interesting to note that with projected climate change, we might actually have more extremes in precipitation and not just a decline. A couple other things you can do with these tools. You can always use this tooltip to find out actual absolute values or the actual values of each of these models at a particular location. So with that, we will check out a few other tools. My favorite one to show people is always the extreme heat tool. I think this is really interesting to look at. So the extreme heat tool is using that daily temperature data from LOCA. And what this is showing us, again, we have a gray line, which is our observed historical data, and then our colored lines are our projected. So the way the extreme heat tool works is we look at the observed historical data and look at all of the data in the warm season and look at the 98th percentile value. And that value is what is an extreme heat threshold for that area. So your extreme heat threshold varies depending on where you are in the state because it's based on that data itself. So this again is defaulting to a grid cell outside of Sacramento. And what we see is that the extreme heat threshold for Sacramento is about 103.9 degrees. I don't think we're going to get that hot today, which is good. So on average, in the historical time period, we got about 4.3 days per year that meet or exceed that threshold. So that makes sense. You know, you can sort of imagine that. But then we start looking at these climate models and looking at the projections in the future. So with an RCP 4.5 scenario, if we can really, you know, make some difference with what we're doing, we are projected by end of century to have about 24 days on average that meet or exceed that threshold. So that's a lot of hot days, probably more than most of us would like to see. But when you go to the RCP 8.5 scenario, you really see a big difference. And this is calculating, I should mention that this is being calculated on the fly from that daily data. So when we look at RCP 8.5 with these four particular climate models, we are projected to see on average about 40 days per year that exceed that temperature. And that's really hot. This tool is very interesting to play around with. Again, we can change locations and look at different areas. One thing, let's see, we can look at cities. And again, you just want to type the name that you're looking for into the search button. So one thing I do want to mention, one of the aggregation data sets that we're really happy to have in CalAdapt is the census tracts with the CalEnviroScreen data. If you're not familiar with CalEnviroScreen, CalEnviroScreen is a tool for identifying neighborhoods that are very high, have high pollution, and also have sensitive populations that are vulnerable to that pollution. So the CalEnviroScreen scores are higher for sensitive areas and sensitive populations. So I know that around Bakersfield we have several of these tracts that are designated as being highly, people are highly impacted by pollution. So we can just select one of these and update our charts again and look at this particular area. So now we're looking at one of these designated one of these communities that's been identified as being highly impactful by pollution and environmental factors. So we can see our CalEnviroScreen score here is a high percentile. So we can actually look at these areas individually. So in this area outside of Bakersfield, our extreme heat threshold is 107.7, and with an RCP of 8.5, we're actually projected to see around 45 days per year in the future that exceed that temperature. So this is a really interesting tool to use, and of course it's important to know, this is projected climate change, so it's important to think about the variability that we're seeing. And it's interesting to see how it varies over the state. So for instance, if we go to Berkeley, California, it's a much different story. In fact, I can do that quickly. So, climate change is expected to impact different parts of the state in different ways. So with Berkeley, take a moment to get that data. Our extreme heat threshold is much lower, and we're projected to see, much less of an increase with climate change. So we're at a cool and comfortable 87.9 degrees there. So I really love this tool. It's a great resource to show people who maybe are less familiar with climate change, because everybody can understand a hot day. It's interesting if you're going out to give talks. You can use this tool to show people what their area is projected to look like. And I think it's just a way that people can really feel what climate change might be like, because I think it's hard to get people to understand that sometimes. So this is a great tool to, again, feel free to look at it, play around with it. So let's see. I don't have time to show you all of the tools today. I wish I did, but I'll show you a couple different ones. I want to look at the Wildfire Tool. I do want to mention, I want to show you that on each of these tools, one thing you can do as well as look at the visualizations, you can scroll down, you can see your models, of course, and you can also learn a little bit about each of the tools, so what the data sets are, the data sources of the tools. I wanted to mention that because I mentioned Leroy Westerling from UC Merced, who created this wildfire data set at his research institution. So that's what this data is showing. So all of the tools allow you to learn more about the data sets. So with the wildfire data, the first thing I want to show you is an animation that we built. So we have this animation on both the Wildfire Tool and also the Snowpack Tool, because you can really see how these are going to, are projected to change over time. So users can change a couple things. What we're seeing is the annual area burned. And with this visualization, we can select a time interval of 10 years or 5 years, and we can select the model. I actually want to look at this warm-dry model, and I want to look at the 8.5 scenario. I don't want to go into the details right now. We are going to have a breakout on wildfire, but you can also change the population growth scenario. So that's something that you can also change as a user. And you can play the animation. So the average annual area burned goes from a lighter color to a darker red. So we can look at how that's projected to change over time. And again, this is a nice thing to put into graphs or slides, just as a real nice way of visualizing how what the projected changes are. I think that is quite impressive. And then, of course, we also have the charting capabilities, as we do with all of the tools. Again, with this tool, we can also change the population scenario. So there's basically 3 different populations, a high population scenario, central, and low. So that does impact the results a bit. As always, we can change our location. So for here, one thing I should mention, since I accidentally clicked on that, we have these default boundaries, but we also have allowed people to upload their own boundary file. So again, if you have a shape file or a GeoJSON or a KML file, you can upload that, and then you can graph all of your own data, all of these data sets for your own area of interest. So right now I want to look at counties, and I want to look at Shasta County. And I can update the chart and look at the results in this area. So I know Shasta has been interested in wildfire information, and we can see that there is projected to be quite a dramatic increase in annual mean hectares burned with climate change scenarios. A couple other things about the tools. I can also look at the RCP 8.5. A couple other things that I didn't mention about the tools. You can change these slider bars. So right now the defaults are this, observed historical data, and then we are looking at defaulting to the end of century. But if you're actually interested in looking at maybe the mid-century information, you can do that easily just by using these slider tools. So you can change the date range that you're looking at. So I know a lot of people maybe need to zoom in on particular time periods, so that's a really helpful feature. You can also zoom in on this chart itself. So you can use these tools to really focus in and look at exact results for a particular time period. So those are some nice features as well. So I'm going to show you one more tool and then show you a little bit more about the site. This is one of our most recent ones, which is our degree days. So this is something that we built more specifically for the energy sector that's looking at cooling degree days and heating degree days for different regions, or again, for whatever region you're looking at. So what we learned with cooling degree days, we use a base temperature of 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and your cooling degree days or your heating degree days are basically a sum of how many degrees above or below that value you get per year. And that's something that's really used for looking at energy efficiency and how much you have to, how much it costs to heat and cool buildings. So we can see, again, we're defaulting to Sacramento, and we can look at the increase, the expected increase in the number of cooling degree days through the end of century. A couple other things about this tool. We can, again, as with all of them, we can save the chart, we can download the data. We can also enter a specific time frame that we want to look at. So right now we're defaulting for a year, but we can also look at a specific month in time if we're interested. So users can change that to look at different time periods. One thing, that we think about, we are always improving these tools. So one thing that we want to add into this in the near future is allowing users to enter in their own base temperature instead of have just a defined 65-degree temperature. So that's something that we're adding into a future version of this. Again, you can always scroll down, look at the information, and look at the data sources. One other thing, let's see, do I have time? I did want to mention one other thing on this extreme heat tool. We will let that go. This, again, is looking at Sacramento. So thinking about extreme heat, I forgot to mention that this tool also has a timing of extreme heat days feature. So what this is showing us is how the timing of these heat events is projected to change in the future. So what we have are the months of the year, and we see that in the historical time period, most of our hot days are, as to be expected, occurring between June and September. But as we go into nearing the end of century, we see that that time frame is broadening, so that now we are expecting extremely hot days from May to October. So that, yeah. We don't right now, but that's the kind of thing that we're interested in hearing, if that's something that you'd like to see. Yeah, so that's a good comment. Yeah, for the moment, we just have it for this tool. What's that? Right, it's not in this, yeah, it's not in this type of, graphic. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the colors are showing you what that temperature is projected to be. So in the historical period, we have more of these purples, which are a little lower, 103.9. But as we're going out towards the end of century, we're getting more and more of these events that are 109 to 119 degrees. So again, our heat is expected to get hotter and also to be a broader heat season. So that's something that's interesting to look at as well. So I don't have time to do more tools. Again, I really encourage you to take a look, play around with it, and sort of explore your areas of interest. I do want to point out, CalAdapt is always a work in progress, as Shruti and Brian will attest to. We're working on tools right now. So the next ones that are coming out, we are also excited about. We're building a tool around long drought scenarios. So looking at temperature, precipitation, and VIC variables for some drought time periods. And then we're also working on stream flow. So we have some data that we'll talk about in a minute that is stream flow data, and we're building a new tool around that. So those are our things that are coming up soon. So just quickly, I do want to go into the other things that you can do on CalAdapt. So we can look at data, and as I mentioned, we can download many of these data sets in many different formats. So we have our LOCA data, we have our observed data, sea level rise, wildfire, snowpack, all of this data is available for you to download. So for many of these variables, we can look at GeoTIFF, we have NetCDF, or getting the data through the API for many of these variables. And again, we have a lot of data that's on the website or that's on the server in NetCDF format that we haven't necessarily built visualization tools around yet. So for example, you can get the relative humidity data or the stream flow data now through the server. We're also really happy about the resources. If you go to the resources page, there's a lot of information to help people understand how to use this data. So you'll see the ICARP, the Adaptation Clearinghouse. The current website is linked to here, as we will also plan on having the future an improved website linked as well. We like this using climate projections. Catherine Davis-Reich at UCLA helped us write some really nice, just important pieces of information for people who maybe are unfamiliar with climate change data. So things like consider different greenhouse gas scenarios separately, remember that future climate projections are not weather predictions, and you can scroll down and see a lot more information about how you use climate data. That was something we heard from a lot of users, that a lot of people don't really know what to do with this information, so I think this can be really useful as well. We have a blog which you can follow, and let me just jump back to this initial landing page. So if you scroll down on our landing page, you also can find information about the CalAdapt API. So we can look at documentation, and this is going to be something that we go over more in detail in a breakout session today, but if you are interested in trying to build your own tools or use the data set within your own application, that's a really good place to start. And as a final plug, you can subscribe to the CalAdapt newsletter. So if you're interested in learning, when we get that streamflow tool up, sign up for the newsletter and we will send you some information. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Susan, who's going to talk a little bit about some specific use cases of energy sector uses of CalAdapt. And you can find that on.
Okay, thanks so much for the demo. Let's see. Yeah, we gotta. Okay, so I'm Susan Wilhelm. Good morning. Thank you for being here, and thanks for the many folks who are also online. This morning, I'd like to offer a brief overview of how energy sector stakeholders are using CalAdapt, as well as a few examples of folks outside the energy sector leveraging the tool. And I'd also like to say just a few words about future plans that the Energy Commission has for development of CalAdapt. Use of CalAdapt has been instrumental in supporting investor-owned utilities' participation in the U.S. Department of Energy's Climate Resilience Partnership. To name a few examples, PG&E used CalAdapt's extreme heat tool to explore intensity and duration of heat waves. Both SoCal Edison and SDG&E used CalAdapt for spatial analyses, GIS-based analyses, to better understand vulnerability of their infrastructures. Since that time, the IOUs have really transitioned from thinking about potential vulnerabilities to planning for resilience. And I'd like to call out, and specifically, San Diego Gas and Electric, as presented at an adaptation workshop on April 29th by Brian D'Agostino. Hi, Brian. SDG&E has used CalAdapt to support actual design of infrastructure, to support investigation of their design standards, and to look at their system hardening strategies. All this to have a systematic approach for resilience for their utility. SoCal Edison, as presented also on August 29th by Adam Smith. Hello, thank you for coming. Told us about how SoCal Edison is using CalAdapt for analyses of projected climate faced by the Mesa substation, and they plan to integrate climate change projections into existing planning models. Ultimately, the utility's 2020 general rate cases will incorporate adaptation actions, and they will be relying on the data that are presented by CalAdapt. As Nancy pointed out in her tour, CalAdapt automatically defaults to 4 so-called priority models. These models were systematically selected through statistical analyses to broadly represent a range of possible futures. And as Nancy mentioned, this is one of a very important thing for our users, and especially for investor-owned utilities, to know, hey, what scenarios do you want us to plan for? So in addition to providing a coherent body of climate projections for actual planning measures, the California Energy Commission and Natural Resources Agency have been using those scenarios as the basis for California's 4th climate change assessment, which is a comprehensive suite of studies that investigate climate-related vulnerabilities and resilience options across a number of sectors. As part of this effort, the Energy Commission is supporting a suite of studies that explore vulnerability and resilience options, and these studies are using the data from CalAdapt. For example, energy researchers involved with the assessment are using the data on CalAdapt for analyses of energy infrastructure and operations as they relate to wildfire, extreme precipitation, and more. What you're looking at in this figure at the bottom is taken directly from CalAdapt, and what you're seeing here basically is that when you select your location, you can pull up various elements of the electricity sector grid. So you can look at transmission lines, substations, and generating facilities. And I pointed specifically to class 25 and 66 in Shasta County because one of the studies that is contributing to the 4th climate change assessment has found that just between year 2000 and 2016, we've had 17 fires within a quarter mile of those transmission paths. And the last thing I'd like to say about this body of research that's relying on the same data that is being relied on for planning is that it really provides a coherent basis for utilities to say, okay, we're doing research based on the same scenarios we have to plan for. So we're trying to be coherent around all of that. Okay, so as a publicly available tool, and many of you know this, CalAdapt has been embraced by a number of resilience efforts beyond the energy sector. There are a lot of examples here, but I'd like to point specifically to the first one, namely that California's 2017 update to the General Planning Guidelines directs governments to CalAdapt to support assessment of climate-related vulnerabilities, which is required now by General Planning Guidelines. The list is long, but let me point out 2 more uses. One is that the California Government Operations Agency, or GovOps, thanks Matt, has leveraged CalAdapt's publicly available API to develop one of the first externally developed automated tools. And this tool supports incorporation of adaptation into sustainability roadmaps, which are undertaken, I understand, for more than about 1,000 state facilities. 1,500, all right. Another interesting use case beyond the energy sector comes from the U.S. Forest Service, which has used CalAdapt for planning at least one fuel treatment, the Tatum Bridge project, with future climate conditions in mind. The Energy Commission, as Nancy mentioned, has supported CalAdapt development to date and will continue to support some evolution of CalAdapt to keep pace with new research and also to respond to emerging energy sector resilience needs. Specifically, the Energy Commission proposes to continue to support CalAdapt enhancements that incorporate additional projections of parameters of interest. These could be parameters that aren't currently projected or these could be improved projections that might offer better resolution or better accuracy to what we have there now. The Energy Commission also plans to incorporate data from California's fourth climate change assessment, which will be released in about a year. Finally, and here's where your input is so important, CalAdapt will continue to produce new tools and visualizations in response to feedback, workshop findings, and guidance from our advisory committee. And with that, I would like to hand it back to Nancy. Let me get you out of my presentation.
Yeah, you know, I asked for to see if people have questions. Are we allowed to do that with WebEx?
We've got plenty of time for that.
Okay.
We would, I think, want to ask people to ask their questions in the mic, just so that we can get everyone.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Okay. So thank you, Susan, for that. That's very helpful. It's great to see how people are really using the tools, so that we're happy to see that. So I just want to spend a few minutes. We are going to go into breakout sessions, so we will be able to spend more time. But I do want to see if anyone has questions right now from what they've seen so far. Anything in particular people would like to ask? Yeah.
Hi, Adam Smith, Southern California Edison. I'm wondering, it doesn't seem like it would be something directly included in CalAdapt, although it was in the wildfire. I know you have Dr. Leroy, seems like right here. Population growth, the energy sector, and especially electric utilities, obviously, we're surveying where there is demand. As we're looking out very long ways into the future, I think, at least in the Southern California region, we're anticipating quite a bit of additional development out through the Inland Empire, maybe buildings that aren't there today, maybe new houses that aren't there today. And I'm wondering, is this either state agencies or, I mean, are there population growth scenarios or, you know, ways we can visualize that could be useful for electric utilities? You know, we are a recipient of climate data in the same way electric utilities are, frankly, a recipient of population growth data. We are not the experts at this stuff. We're the users of this stuff. So I don't know. Maybe it's just a question for a number of people, maybe even folks in the crowd. I just don't know the answer to that. Are there, you know, it seems like we have some population growth stuff. Are there others that would be useful for utilities to be thinking about or checking out?
I'm going to let Susan answer that. I think there are data sets out there.
Thanks. And I'll give you a first answer, and then I'll punt to David. But to support California's fourth climate change assessment, we did partner with the Department of Finance to develop extended population growth projections beyond 2060, which is where they typically would end. So most of the data on climate, most of the CalAdapt data nominally aren't really sensitive to population. I mean, temperature, precip. I mean, on some level, LOCA is a statistically based method that kind of implicitly incorporates heat islands, but I don't want to go there. I don't know enough about it. I think, you know, we do have those data, and it would be great for us to hear about how the utilities would use it, what sort of granularity you would want in a visualization, what sort of time horizons you would want. I mean, the 2100 that's looking really far down the line, but you know, we could think about incorporating that into things like cooling degree days, heating degree days, could think about a cumulative tool. So we would love to hear your ideas on that. And even if you don't come up with all of them today in the breakouts, please, you know, send us feedback. We do want to hear from you. Yeah. And David Tom's can say more about the actual data, but just so you know, he's back there. Oh, if you'd like to, yeah. Up to you. You know more about this, right?
So as Susan said, the population projection data was Department of Finance. Through 2060, it's the same as the data that they post on their demographic website. For the fourth assessment, the fourth climate change assessment, they agreed to extrapolate that out to 2100 under 3 different levels of growth scenarios by changing the immigration and fatality and mortality rates, things like that. Those data, like the ones on their website, are county level projections. They're not, you know, detailed. Yeah. It's a fairly sophisticated model based on those different rates and assumptions about those rates for each county. But it's not, and I'm going to get in trouble here if I speculate too much about how much of the information, and one of the things actually we were interested in doing is some of the fourth assessment projects that were using that data that were interested, for instance, in comparing it to SCAG's projections, which at the county level were a little bit different. I can't remember which one had a slightly higher population growth figure. And I believe SCAG's is a lot more spatially disaggregated as well. So that's probably more than sufficient for now. We can talk later. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David, and thanks for the question, Adam. I'll hand it back to Nancy. We're yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of people on the line. Thanks.
I'm just wondering how this tool compares to other data visualization tools like Climate Wizard.
So I'm not quite sure what Climate Wizard does. Yeah.
So I think Climate Wizard is using a different downscaling technique. So the downscaling technique that we're using is local analogs. That is almost like the official downscaling technique that we should use in the state. So that's the main difference. But in addition, the federal government has adopted LOCA. So now the feds pay script to use LOCA to develop the same type of climate projection for the U.S. as a whole, and that's being used for the next national assessment. So I'm trying to say this LOCA is the official downscaling data set that you should use.
Thanks, Gita.
Thank you. I do know that, I know there's a lot of other sites out there. I don't really know of anything else that allows access to the primary data as well as the visualization tools and all the different data access methods. So I know that that's one thing that CalAdapt really specializes in. So anybody else? Yes.
I'm Jessica Knapstein, PG&E. I know that for the sea level rise data, there's some talk about creating probability distribution functions of the data coming out in around January, from what I understand. And for decision making, that kind of information is really useful for us. And I was wondering if that is in the pipeline for any of the other climate impacts, and if and when. And I know that there was also a discussion of a cost-benefit analysis potentially being put together at the joint meeting with the CEC and CPUC, HYPER. And I think that would be very helpful in that discussion as well.
Yeah, I think a little bit of that is beyond Nancy's domain in terms of what data will be developed. We would love to hear from PG&E and the other IOUs especially on what data sets would be useful to you. You know, we do have, and it is on the extreme heat tool, the ability to look at, say, like the how many exceedances of the 98th percentile historical temperature. So there are a lot of ways to look at, you know, instead of annual average at Tmax, you know, look at some percentile of a daily maximum, for example. We want to hear from you guys on that and know what you need, I think, before we start developing more on that. But in terms of ways to slice and dice the data we have, I think we do have very much the capacity to look at, you know, things beyond averages. So please, when you have ideas, do send them in terms of the data we have. In terms of what you'd like to see developed, though, come to the Energy Commission. In terms of the cost-benefit analysis, that's beyond both of our domains. But thank you for bringing that up again. I'll delay that.
Yeah, and as Susan mentioned, we really are interested in hearing ways that people would like us to visualize this data, you know, so that's very helpful that that's something you'd be interested in. So, yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Thank you all for providing this workshop and the information and updates. They've been extremely useful in the work that Caltrans has conducted so far on our own vulnerability assessments, but also working with GovOps on our assessment of facility impacts. And I wanted to just continue showing support for the development of additional tools, and that share that it's really important to us that the API and all of these primary data tools are openly accessible. That's excellent. I particularly would be interested in, for just general population needs, like the humidity data that was referenced. I think that could be really important to cross with the temperatures and understand when public health impacts are going to start being seen across the board as a result of those two combined. I'm not sure if you already have it, and I feel like I should, though. Information about the vertical resolution of your maps, if there is any as of right now. I know that you referenced potentially adding stream flows and hydrologic modeling, both of which I've been told depend very much on having very precise vertical elevation or digital elevation model type LiDAR data in order to understand how those stream flows and hydraulic dynamics might change. So I guess that's both a question and a statement. Is that already part of the tool, and could it be a consideration for future development? And then the last part to what Susan just mentioned about looking at different statistics of temperature, your teams have been extremely helpful in extracting some of those statistical analysis, but I was wondering if there's also thoughts towards being able to extract those from the site itself, or if it's through continued coordination with the research teams that we would get different types of temperature outputs or different statistical analysis.
I'm going to respond to just one question on the digital elevation models. You know, in some cases, like with John Rathew's data set that portrays inundation associated with various increments of sea level rise plus an extreme storm, there is a very high resolution digital elevation model that underlies that, and then CalAdapt plots the results. But as to any DEMs within CalAdapt, like that.
Yeah, I don't know, again, we're interested in hearing what new data sets people might be interested in. I don't know that there's, we probably don't have room for anything like that right now, but if there is interest in, DEMs, they're not available through the website now. But again, I think the modeling that creates these data layers does account for that. We are interested, there's many different data sets, again, that come out of the VIC modeling, including relative humidity, that we have available on the server and through the API. We actually have many slides that show many lists of different variables that we have. We don't quite have time to go over all of that today, but we are really interested, especially in the breakouts, in hearing what other data sets you would like to see. And one of the things that we also think a lot about is how you want to see how it could be useful to visualize these things together, like you said, looking at relative humidity and heat. So that's something we're interested in hearing from you. What's most useful to you as the users? Yeah.
Jessica Canastine, PG&E again. Along those lines, we were interested in, as Adam aptly pointed out, having the experts kind of tell us how I know that this is an area of climate science that there's a lot of uncertainty in, but how interactive effects feed in to this. So, for example, how drought might impact wildfire, might impact heat days, and how we might think about planning in a scenario when all three of those are compounding, as opposed to just getting one, right?
I'm not sure that we either are the experts in that. We do the data visualization. I hope that is a question. Okay. Right. But yeah, I think that's a great question and something that we should think about. And it could be, I think having some of the researchers in the room to talk more about that and how those things interact would be really a great idea. So sorry if that's not too helpful. But yeah, we're interested in hearing from you how we might want to, do the visualization tools around looking at multiple factors together. So I really appreciate all the questions. We do have time in the breakouts for more. So I do want to just quickly talk about those a little bit. One thing I did want to ask is how many people in the room have used CalAdapt? Can you just raise your hand? Oh, great. That's wonderful to see. How many people have used the new site, so CalAdapt 2.0 or the beta? Oh, great. So a lot of you have. Excellent. I'm glad to see it. I have a couple general questions that I am hoping to talk about more in the breakouts. We don't have time to do it right now, but this is some of the feedback we'd really like to get from people. So how you've used CalAdapt. What did you like about using it? Did you find the tools helpful? And what would you suggest for improvement? So we don't have time to do that right now, but I would like you to sort of think about these, and in your breakout sessions, maybe you could address some of those questions, because we really want your feedback on how useful it is for you. So, and the other thing, we really are looking for your ideas on what new tools that we maybe don't have right now, what really would be helpful for you. So, again, thinking about some things like maybe this relative humidity, is that something we want to build a visualization tool around? What do you find most useful? So we will break out into, our goal was to have 4 focus groups. And I'm going to go through each of these a little bit, but think about which ones you might find most interesting. So we want to break out into one group that's specifically looking at the climate tools, so temperature, precipitation, and relative humidity. So again, we don't have a tool built around relative humidity right now, but we might in the future. That's something that we could do if there was interest in it. But we want to talk about a couple things like what additional features would make the existing tools more useful. Things like additional statistics. Do we want to look at distributions as well as means, and is that valuable? I don't want to lead people in what to discuss, but these are some of the ideas that we've had that we would like your feedback on. Do we want to look at monthly or seasonal averages in addition to annual averages? Using a user-defined threshold in extreme heat. So those are some of the things we'd like to talk about and hope to get your feedback on for the climate tools. We also want to talk specifically about the Wildfire Tool. So with the Wildfire Tool, what additional features would make that more useful? There is monthly data. Would you prefer to see it at a monthly time step? Do you want to look at multivariate charts, so including more information on a chart? And then I think that we will have some data available on fire severity and emissions in the future, and are those things that you're interested in building tools around? So those are some of our questions, and again, we don't want to lead you too much. We are looking for your feedback. So one thing that's going to be new, you guys get to be in on the tool development. So we talked about this streamflow data, and we are just working now on building a new tool showing visualizations of this streamflow data. So if that's something you're interested in, this would be really helpful for us to hear what you're interested in seeing right now while we're in the middle of building this tool. And this group can also talk about some of the other hydrological projections, so the snowpack tool, and then also some of the other VIC variables. Are there there's a huge data set of VIC variables that we have on the site. Are there other things that you'd like to build visualizations around? And then our last but not least group is really focused, it's more of a technical group, so focused on how to really use the CalAdapt API. And we're very lucky to have Brian and Shruti here who are going to work with you and sort of show you some examples of how to use the API, and then also talk about some of the information we have on the website and what you really can use that for. So I would say that's a little bit more of a technical group, so you don't need to be a programmer, but you might need to have a little bit more technical knowledge to really get much out of that, just to see what's possible with the API. So those are the groups, and we do want to make sure that people are interested in all of those. And of course, you're welcome to talk about, anything that comes up in any of these groups. But I would like a raise of hands, and Susan is going to help with this because she knows which rooms to go to. So I want to see how many people would be interested in going to the Climate Tools group. Okay, up here. Okay, great. And Susan will be leading that group. What about the projected wildfire risk? Who's interested in going to that? Great. Okay. Well, okay. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, but so we followed David to wildfire. Yes, and we're very lucky because we have the developer of that data here to talk about it. So all our questions will be answered. And what about the snowpack, stream flow, and other hydrological projections? Okay, great. Okay. Follow Guido to wherever he goes. Great. And then how many people are interested in our CalAdapt API and custom tool development? Okay. All right. Okay. Great. And don't lose Shruti and Brian on that one. So, yeah, great. 11:30, right. So, yes, we are coming back here. Again, I do ask that everybody, somebody in each group take notes, and we'll bring them back here by 11:30. All right? Thank you. Yeah. What is this? You can follow them. They're out. Yeah. Thanks so much. Great.
Hi, Gary, are you online?
Yes. Who's this?
David Stahns.
Hello, David. Larry Dale wants to join too, and he's been online. I'm not sure if his audio is working, but... David? Hello? Hello? Well, I'm right now the audio has been cut off, and I'm trying to call them back, but the line is they haven't hung up on their end. There's no audio, but they've got the line locked. Sorry, that's the cell phone. Yeah, that's what I'm trying, and they said stay on the line, but that's not working. I'll keep trying. I did. I'll let you know if I can get in anywhere. Let me keep trying. Okay, that went away for me. I'm not. So here, I've got to keep trying something here. I'll get back to you.
I can do that. I can do that.
It's fried.
Okay.
From past experience, so.
Right. I can do that then.
I listen really well, but
all right.
it doesn't come out the pencil.
Right. Okay, that's fine. Sure. I do want to make sure that we get back.
Group,
oh, yeah.
And I could take some, I plan to take notes too.
Yeah. Wait for one more person to come back.
For internet. Oh, just for Wi-Fi?
No other people were using it.
It should be the same as the, it's like automatically logs you out. Is that yes. Call me one. ECM.
Well, great. We are lucky to have you, Leroy, for any questions we may have on the data itself. That's great.
All right. Thank you, ma'am.
One more person.
Are we still waiting for
Yeah.
a couple people? Sorry, I'm in. Task.
It looks like there were several people who were not able to call in today. Just now seeing my... Yeah, WebEx seems like it's always an issue, huh? Yeah. Great. Well, thank you again for coming and for joining. I do want to go around and just see, I want to see some introductions. So if you don't mind just saying your name, where you work, and maybe if you've used CalAdapt and what you've used it for. So you've already met me already, Nancy Thomas, and I'm the director of the Geospatial Innovation Facility. So, you know, I have to say that I can talk about CalAdapt a lot, but I don't actually develop the tools, so that, you know, our great web developers do a lot of that work. So, but I think, you know, I've been really happy with the great response that we've gotten, especially with some of the new visualizations that we have. And we're really looking forward to hearing your feedback, any feedback at all about the site and what information you may have and what you need from us.
Great.
So, yeah.
I can go next, I guess. I'm Nikki Caravelli, and I'm from Sierra Business Council Web and Truckee, and I'm hosting a webinar in about a week on climate tools for our Sierra Nevada network for planning for resources. I wanted to feature CalAdapt, so I haven't actually used the tool, so I'm here more to learn, but also hopefully add something to this conversation about wildfire.
Great.
My name is Lisa Mary. I work at Ascent Environmental here in Sac. We mostly use CalAdapt for EIRs and vulnerability assessments. I'm actually the GIS person, so I'm usually pulling things for people, and prior to the shapefile tool, I would have to process that all. So a lot of our just questions stuff has to be, you know, we're always comparing to baseline and trying to figure out what baseline is. And, yeah.
Great.
Hi, I'm Margaret Cooper. I'm currently an intern at California Office of Emergency Services. We use CalAdapt a lot. It's like in our state hazard mitigation plan, and especially for hazard mitigation. Personally, I've only been on it to play around with the tools, and I have not really gone in depth looked at it. But what I have seen, I have enjoyed how user-friendly the CalAdapt 2.0 is.
Great. Thank you.
Anthony Westerling, Leroy Westerling, what I go by. But Anthony's on all my papers, and I made these data more than once.
Probably many times.
Yeah, CalAdapt has.
Great.
And I'm David Stubbs with the Energy Commission, helping with the some of the energy sector part of the fourth climate assessment, and particularly kind of being kind of the wildfire liaison with Leroy. And I guess we have at least one or more people on the phone here.
Right. So for the people who are on the phone, can you hear us? And do you want to introduce yourselves?
Yes, I just got back in touch with the phone, with the audio. This is Gary Fitz with the LBL Wildfire Research Team. And I know Larry Dale and Sarah McDonald are trying to get through. Is this the wildfire group?
Yes, yes it is.
Okay, thank you, I'm here.
Great. Anyone else? Okay. Gary, do you want to mention if you have used CalAdapt and maybe what you have used it for? I'm trying to get an idea from everybody on how well they know the tools.
Yes, we've been using CalAdapt to check our own calculations. CalAdapt shows us the area burn statistics, and we've been developing probability statistics, but it's still a great cross-check. And I know that Lloyd Dixon's insurance research project down at RAND has been using CalAdapt to decide which climate models to bracket our results with. I've been working with them also.
Great. Well, thank you. And we'll go ahead, and then if Larry is able to join us, we hope he will be able to. So what we're interested in really is just some general feedback, and we are really lucky to have Leroy here. So if anyone has any questions, about the data in particular, maybe we could start with that. Or, what we're interested in are really what additional features would you be interested in seeing in, the Wildfire tool that we currently have. So if anyone has any ideas about that, including you, you're welcome to let us know what kind of visualizations you think would be good.
I think for us, timing and severity would be helpful, but then also one of the most recent things we had is in looking at the tool, like what to kind of use for current, for baseline, to compare it to kind of give an overall painting the picture, like, percent increase or how much, increase as opposed to just presenting, in 2050, 65 hectares. Right. Kind of not really knowing what to have. Yeah, like what to use in the tool and the data. Because, for climate, it shows, the gray line.
Right, there's observed data. Right.
Yeah, you see the actual numbers, but it doesn't automatically do comparisons for you. You sort of have to do that on the side currently. You said timing and severity?
Yeah, we talk about, fires are going to start occurring earlier in the year or, last longer into the season.
So, the timing, the initial data are generated monthly, right? But that's a lot more files, so that's not what goes into CalAdapt. But that could be used to estimate changes in the effective fire season length, what fraction burns by what starts burning by what time. You remember we're modeling when the fire starts, not when the burning actually takes.
But that would, if there's some sort of shift in that they're starting earlier.
Right.
Right. So we could capture the changes at the beginning of the fire season a lot more easily than the end. The fires burn longer after they ignite. We're not going to know.
Right.
That's what's happening now in the observations, right? And so the fire season has increased substantially across the West in observed data. I can give you a paper in mind just how that changed now. And about half of that increase is earlier start, and about half of that increase is burning later into the fall. So we'd be missing about half the change in the fire season.
Larry, your voice faded out. Can you say that again?
Okay, so when you look at the recent historical data for forest fires anyway, the length of the fire season, the way I define it is the time between the first report of a large fire igniting that eventually becomes large and the last control date or containment date, right? So those bracket the season, and there's been a really dramatic increase over the last 40 years in the length of the fire season, over 80 days west-wide. And I have published the numbers for each sort of sub-region as well. But about half of that increase is due to earlier starts or earlier ignitions of large fires, but another half is due to sort of burning later into the fall. And that's a combination of ignitions later in the year and longer burn times. So the fires have gone from burning about 5 days on average to over 50 days on average for large fires.
It would be really useful for us not to get the monthly fire projections, but to get a separate fire season length distribution over the years, if that is something that CalAdapt could show.
Okay, that would be feasible with the data that we have on hand. This is David. Would there be a possibility when you showed that graph of the heat, extreme heat or heat waves expanding
the seasonality,
width of the season as well as the magnitude? Would there be
something, would that be a useful and feasible thing to do with fire?
So say it again. The width of this.
Remember,
I was multitasking, so I didn't look at
I can.
correct.
So
yeah.
I guess I can. Can I hook my laptop up?
So it has, year on the x-axis, month on the, the y-axis, and then it just shows the dates of those, and color-coded by the magnitude of the extreme heat.
Yeah, I think we could
and then it fans out, just like similar to fire season.
Yeah.
You could do something like the number of large fires by month. If you want to get the whole thing in there, the distribution of ignitions. Right? Or you could do the fraction that ignite. You might lose the change in the absolute number. But,
what's the cutoff for large fire? How are you?
So this is a statistical model, and sorry, I inhaled my coffee. This time we use the monitoring trends and burn severity data set.
Oh, okay.
Which is our remote sense fire severity and extent GIS layer from the Forest Service, and the strengths of that data set are that it uses a more coherent approach to fires across, that in the documentary record might be reported differently, but based on what agency is reporting them. So here you get more of a coherent treatment, and so it's slightly more comprehensive in terms of the number of the actual fires that are in it. The drawback is that it doesn't start till 1984, so it's kind of you're missing a lot of the earlier data which are available back to the 1970s for most of the western U.S. federal lands anyway. And in California, CAL FIRE has got pretty good coverage too. So those are trends, and part of that is that the minimum fire size cutoff in that data set usually is 1,000 acres, or what's that, about 400 hectares, yeah. And so that gave us a little bit larger threshold fire size, which means that in some forests, you typically, like up to a quarter of the area burned might be in the smaller fires that we're not modeling. They also tend to be a lot less responsive to climate variability, and so that's something that we're not capturing. The thing about this data are really good for capturing extreme events, right? But not so much, my simulations, but not so much for sort of the little stuff that doesn't vary a lot. It's more driven by like ignitions along roadways than it is by climate variability.
One of the things I wanted to ask about, and I guess I can't get on the internet, maybe I can use your password as well. So I think, I could be wrong, it's hard for me to remember all the different data sets, but I think that we don't have, with the temperature and precipitation, we have the observed historical data, but I don't think that there's an observed historical wildfire data set.
We provided this individual research groups that asked for it, but we haven't provided it to CalAdapt.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I must have been asking the wrong people. Yeah, it's always great to have the actual observed historical. So yeah, for some reason I didn't think that was available, but that would be great.
Yeah, so that's like 1984.
Okay.
I forget which recent year, like 20.
Okay.
14 or 15.
I think it's 14 or 15. Yeah, I can't remember.
Okay, great. Yeah, because we always like to look at that, and for some reason I wasn't sure that was available. Well, I will send you an email then. Yeah, because that's something we definitely like to see. And then, then you can start going more towards comparing to a baseline. So that's something,
Do you want the raw data, or do you want, like...
it gridded to...
Well, so we gridded it.
Okay, I guess we want the gridded.
Like, occurrence.
A question about it. Does the uploading of the boundaries, I'm not sure how you do this, but is there some way to incorporate like different forest management scenarios and like upload that and see how that affects the
wildfire play out?
So in the fire size modeling, we have two model parameterizations, one for the Sierra Nevada and one for the rest of the state, because the Forest Service gave us fuels management scenarios for the Sierra Nevada. And so we designed the model to be able to incorporate those. And we are doing additional runs this fall, incorporating those fire management scenarios, and they have a strong impact on the fire size distributions. Cool. We're also doing severity runs.
Right.
So I did a severity run actually for business as usual without any fuels management. And then we're doing some variations on that. So one is no fuels management, but implementing heuristics for showing the impact of the forest mortality from the recent drought on future fire. So we have the Forest Service gave us, basically they prescribed an approach how they wanted us to alter the probabilities of a fire occurring and getting to, for severity only. And so we're going to do that. And then we'll also be doing some of the fuels management scenarios for the fire severity.
Can I ask about the severity, what the units of the output?
Yeah, so the unit of the severity, so there's a lot of different severity metrics. And the metric that the Forest Service is paying us to look at is BA 90, so that's when 90% of the basal area of the trees is killed. So that's a really high severity metric. And we have from them a customized product of the historical BA 90 based on the monitoring transit burn severity data set.
So the fire, is it a probability number
area.
per cell? Oh, it's an area.
Yeah, so what we're doing is we are, in this initial run, we're just looking at the high severity area. So for every incident where we had a fire, 1,000 acres or more, we estimate the high severity burned area. And that high severity burned area, so it's not a truncated distribution right now. So that means we draw a bunch of high severity burned areas. They could be larger than the total area drawn for the fires because they're independent distributions. So it's kind of a orthogonal product in that sense. We could take it and look at how the high severity burned area changes over time. If you're specifically, think your risk of responding to high severity burned area, you can use that instead of this. We weren't sure if we were going to run it for every fuels treatment scenario. There's a lot of fuels treatment scenarios because we're doing additional processing to that data that's quite time consuming on top of what you would be using. So hearing feedback about that is useful. The scenarios from the Forest Service basically go from like about 15% treatment to close to 100% treatment of the treatable area, and not all of those are realistic. The other thing is we'll probably be focusing the severity run on just going out to mid-century. So or I think something like that. I actually think the first one I ran till end of century, but I'll have to check on that.
So I guess I was thinking that severity was going to be, different classes, like 5 classes or something of severity, but it's not.
Different. That's a different kind of severity. And that's there too. But we have models for that, but we haven't been running them.
Okay.
The Forest Service was asking specifically for BA 90. Okay. And the thing is that BA 90 or say BA 50 or high and moderate severity combined or something like that would all be highly correlated with each other. So if you're doing one, it's kind of like you're doing the other. So as an index of risk, it's really kind of redundant to do them all. If you really want to know how it changes from the historic period. If that makes sense.
So is that something that you guys are interested in seeing? Again, I sort of had in my head that it was the, severity classes that would just be another visualization tool that we would include. How would you be interested in looking at this type of data? Or is that a high priority?
It's not so much like quantitative that we need to look at it, but in some cases, like the amount of area burned may not change. However,
the severity
of what is burning is increasing. So it's not so much we need to present, like a quantitative type thing.
Are you specifically interested in Sierra Nevada?
I mean, we have projects all over, but it seems like for this, with the extreme fires, that it would be more focused. And we do have a lot of projects.
I have another project with Matt Hurto at University of Mexico in Albuquerque, funded by AFRI, which is another EPA.
Right.
And there we're doing integrated vegetation modeling, fire modeling, so vegetation modeling dynamic. And we have a paper. I was editing the response to reviewers downstairs while I was talking and trying to see all the things. But in this fuels management scenarios in Sierra Nevada and effects on both fire size and severity. And actually the severity, the size doesn't change because that's sort of the way we parameterize the model, but the severity changes really dramatically with the pace of treatment. So we can talk about that. That's probably going to be out soon.
Okay. But not necessarily something that would need to be on CalAdapt or, right.
I have a comment / maybe question about the smaller level fires that you said weren't captured by the model. Because I'm sure it's common in not just this year in Nevada, but for instance, like lightning events. I just drove past one last night.
Right.
It turned off the power for like half the city, but it was a small fire.
Right.
So, is there some way to capture like does lightning increase with more extreme precipitation events, and does that correlate to like?
So this is a complex question.
Yeah.
Multiple things we're asking about here. One is it changing ignition, right? And our model is basically implicitly assuming that ignitions, the time you're talking about, lightning, don't change over time.
Okay, interesting.
So it's static. What changes is whether or not those ignitions can grow at a fast enough rate that they escape control early on, fire. And another way to think about it is that we often have enough ignition, right? And especially around populated areas, so depending what kind of fire you're talking about. And what the limiting factor usually is not ignition, but the rate of spread. So whether the climatic conditions or the fuels, they are a big fire. One approach we have taken, we did not do this time, was we actually have some historic lightning data for this region, and we've incorporated it into models before. And we didn't project changes in lightning, but we used different lightning scenarios from past observations. Combine projected climate with lightning from a specific year and look at what different lightning environments come out with.
That might be, because I'm thinking in terms of impacts that like very quickly affect the energy sector.
Yeah. So it's an issue in the Sierras, especially. Well, and that's sort of California montane forests. Right? The biggest source of interannual variability is really lightning, clustered lightning ignition. You don't have a good sense of how that changes with it. So scenario approach is better.
Leroy, the audio is on the phone is fading again.
It's a plot. Sorry. So I was saying, because we don't really know under climate change for sure, how lightning environment's going to change, that it's better to take a scenario approach. And that's not something that we incorporated this time, but it could be done. And we've done it with seasonal forecasting models in the past, and it's not hard to do.
So I had a couple questions also about like what data sets, I guess, are still being created or are still available, I guess, through the fourth assessment then. So fire severity is not something we're going to have like
Sure.
in class.
Not in class-based, but it's BA90.
That in BA90.
Yeah, because like I say, what you really want is to know how it's changing over time. And if I did BA90, BA50, or the high severity category out of those 5 classes, they're going to, the spatial distribution change and the temporal variability is going to be the same. It's just the absolute level will be a little bit different. But if you're indexing an historic risk to a particular thing, then all you need really is to change over time.
And I know another data set that we had talked about that I wanted to ask you about is emissions, because I know we've had a couple people ask about emissions from
Yeah, we're kind of behind schedule on the emissions because we redid stuff.
Right.
Severity. But that's a fairly easy thing. So it's, we take the area burned and we take the vegetation layer from land fire, and we have basically a factor that's multiplied each one that gives you the emissions. Emission scenarios.
Okay. Is that something that you guys, as users, would be interested in? The emissions, or is that like a not as high a priority?
I think so, especially combining that with like the different forest management areas.
Yeah, so that would be at the source. It wouldn't be, there's no transport. Have exposure.
Right.
And we'll be doing more work with that if you're interested in that going forward. So we got funding from the University of California for another 4 years to just looking at emissions and its impact on public health. So it's a new multi-campus research initiative on climate and public health. And wildfire is a big part of that.
I have a question to see if people are interested in the, and I know you've mentioned it before, is currently it's showing average data. It's kind of smooths out all the variability of the fire. With sort of extreme events is what really drives the action.
Well, so you have the data for individual fire events and everything too, right? So are you not displaying that at all, or are you just displaying the averages?
It's the annual averages is what we have now.
We didn't pull the other data from our servers?
I think we have everything. So we have all of our data is available on the server, and then we're doing the visualizations around pieces of that.
Okay, so the averages are like one out of a bunch of files. Yeah.
Because I know you're running 100 simulations.
1,000 simulations.
1,000 simulations.
For each of the 3 population scenarios.
Let's see what we have on the... so what the visualization tool is doing now is the annual averages. But that's something that we have talked about other ways of showing it. We could conceivably look at the monthly data.
Rather than the monthly data, I think the annualized fires on the landscape.
I guess what do you mean by that? That's
well, so we take the fires that are monthly and we sum up the area in each grid cell that ignited from and spread from that grid cell, and then we allocate it onto the landscape.
Right.
So all the area burned for that year, and the fires can be limited by burning into each other.
Right. Well, that is what we're showing.
No, you're showing the average.
But it's the annualized average.
Right. So it's the average across 1,000 or 1,000 simulations. So it doesn't tell you about the extreme events that are driving that, which are in that other data. Now, you had asked about, people have asked at different times about like a 95th percentile or something like that.
That's kind of what I was...
And I knew that's where you're going, so I wanted to go to that. And the reason that I haven't done that yet, anyway, is because if if you're just looking at 1,000 simulations in a grid cell for 1 year, fire is still just not that frequent. So you don't have a big enough sample on an annual basis to do a 95th percentile, right? I'd have to do way more simulations than 1,000 to get enough fires to give you a 95th percentile. So you have to aggregate them in some way. So like multiple years and maybe, so the vegetation simulation, come back, there we go. So the reason that the models don't change much with the population, so this is like, this is BAU. This is a change in vegetated area over the centuries. Business as usual. Right? It barely moves as a fraction of the model landscape. Right? That flat line is going from like 87 to 85 or something like that percent vegetated. So the vegetated area under the USGS projections barely budges, right? So regardless of whether it's high or low or anything like that, you just don't have much change in the vegetated area. And then if you think about the maps that she was showing this morning, where were all the fires burning? Mostly on public federal land in the Sierra Nevada, where there's no development because the land is public. So the biggest burning area in the state, in the area that changes the most, has no impact on either population or vegetation change in areas. And then the areas where it does have an effect, well, his simulations are just not that responsive. Vegetation doesn't change that much. And if you look at what's going on around a populated area, if the vegetated area is decreasing and the population is increasing, the effects can cancel each other out when you start aggregating across multiple grid cells. So one thing we could do is aggregate across the 3 population scenarios. Right? So then we have 3,000 simulations instead of 1,000 simulations. And we could do over multiple years. So instead of having annual, maybe decadal or something like that, there might be enough that way to get it.
Leroy, can I jump in here for a second? We've been aggregating across the population Monte Carlos and the decade to so we can get percentile burn areas. We've been doing that for the RAND insurance project. We have that data. We've got 80, 85th, 90, 95th, 99th percentile burn areas for...
And you had enough fires in a decade, or over 3,000 simulations to do that, or?
Yeah. We never see a percentile. The 70th percentile on down is always 0, but above that we start to see burn areas starting at about the 75th percentile.
What do you mean by always 0?
Well, if you just make a list of all the annual burn areas over all the simulations and all the population Monte Carlos, you make that list and sort it, and then 70% of that list is always 0. And when you get up to the...
Oh, I see what you mean. Like 70% of the time there's no fire.
Right.
In that cell, or...
Yeah.
Right, yeah, this is per cell.
Right.
Okay, so you're doing your 95th percentile over all of time rather than all of fires.
Well, all of the decade and all of the simulations for that decade and all of the population runs.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking more narrowly, like a conditional thing. Given that there's a fire, what's the size distribution?
Yeah, we could do that, given that there's a fire, but we haven't done that yet.
Okay, I'm not sure what's more useful for people.
The insurance project wants wants to know the absolute percentile burn.
Okay.
But we've got the tools to do that. It's just another run, if anybody's interested.
And if you're doing it by grid cell, it's capped at what we allowed to burn in the grid cell. So basically,
right.
Yeah, you're just looking at a fraction, and then it caps out at 100% of the average vegetated area per grid cell.
Right, 3290 hectares, I think.
That's right, yeah. That was the average vegetated area over all the model grid cells in the state. So.
Right. When you said you have 1,000 simulations, you're including, you're aggregating across the 10 population runs, is that right?
Right, so the 10 population runs for each of the scenarios make even less difference, right? High versus low. So yeah. But it was a convenient way to break up the file so that the file size is not humongous.
Right.
Yeah. There's another thing I'd like to ask, if this is a good time. I noticed, is there anyone from the IOUs in this session?
No.
No, there isn't, because I noticed they were interested in certain kinds of data, and I noticed that, Nancy, are you there? You showed a figure that I think we produced the fire risk along transmission path 25 and 26.
Oh, right, yeah. Susan included that.
Susan did.
Yep.
And I'm just would like to get some feedback if that's if that's useful to the IOUs. You know, we want to do more of that. But there's nobody from the IOUs here now, so
right.
Maybe we can find out later.
My feeling is that it would be, I think, but I also am not from an IOU, so.
Yeah. You guys have a technical advisory committee coming up shortly, so, and I think there's somebody from at least one of the IOUs on that. So it might be a good time to ask.
Good. Thanks.
So, Leroy, I wanted to go back about what other data set you were thinking that we need to visualize on CalAdapt. Maybe it's just the names of the data sets. I actually can't see what I have available on the API. I just want to make sure we're not missing something that we need to have. So I just wanted to ask you again exactly what data set you're referring to. I know I find the wildfire, it's complicated. For some reason, I'm not able to log on.
There's no way you can do a screen share for this, is there?
What's that?
Is there any way to do a screen share for what you're about to show?
I'm not hooked up.
Oh, okay.
But I'll describe to you.
Okay. Look at that. We should probably wrap up. Short, huh? Probably not the best note taker either, but try.
This talks about not necessarily a training page, but sample scenarios, get new users who are unfamiliar with kind of planning or using the tool, try this, say you want to plan for this, this, and this, and then you try different things and then come up with a vulnerable sample. That doesn't have to be super comprehensive.
So this is what the raw annualized data look like.
Okay.
So this is a 1 year and one scenario. And you can see the fires are square. All right, and what's showing is the area burned in color coding within each of the small grid cells. So the green is basically not burning.
Right.
And then these red and yellow splotches are fires, or fires that burn together. And so your averages are the averaging across a bunch of layers like this.
So you said that's still an annual, that's still per year.
Right, because most grid cells only have one fire or one grid cell over the
Okay.
year. But there can be multiple fires in a grid cell or multiple fires in neighboring grid cells, maybe igniting in a different month. And then we look and see, well, what's the total area burn they want to have? And where we overlap them, they get reduced. And then we have an aggregated sort of area burned perimeter. It's just a big circle, well, square, because they're so that's what they look like. I mean, it might be off-putting to people because they're square, but if you had a simulation that sort of showed these things over time, or in a given year across 100 simulations or 1,000 simulations, people can see that inherent variability in the fire, which is not like Star Trek. The old Star Trek.
Right.
What it looks like.
Okay. Right. Sure we. I know that we downloaded all the data that you had.
Yeah, you've got these. So, like one file, one that has 100 in it, grid, 147.
That's what we're using. I'll have to double check. That's
no, the file has a new name, and that's what you mean.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The fewer dimension.
Okay. Great. We'll look into that.
My brain can at around the 95th percentile. Many of the cells are all.
Think about it. There's a what each
I know.
have in it, right? So that you can a fraction of that earned over thousands of emissions within 90% of that.
Right, but I think people in by year, but like you're saying, there's not enough.
I don't think.
Right, it makes sense.
But your simulation, people were able to apply either 5 or 10.
Yeah. That was 5 or 10 years. So chunk it up into time frame. Great. Well, we do actually have back. Careful echo. Does anyone have any other ideas they would like around the wildfire?
I guess my final question, if possible, but if is like how that would change, and we know that with fire, we're expected to change either like a drought scenario, severe fires, but then rainy season, we also increase the cost of fires because there's like increase of like lower grasses. So like, is there a way to map those models for comparison of how we can climate change and then the effect to increase fire severity, longer fires?
Yeah.
You can expect in the CalAdapt.
Oh, it depends how catered you want it. Let me show you a figure.
Yeah, I mean that's something I've thought about as well. If that's something that users are interested in. I mean we've done plotting that's just that for one model, sure, precipitation versus wildfire. So we have draft graphs that show that. Yeah, I'm not sure how to that information, but that's something to do if there's because again that's something about how we can do better around the data we.
Or maybe it's like with the relative ability because and how if that like action or like create the fire be larger, so maybe have humidity of fire.
So this is something like so here's quantile temperature in historic objective, right? And quantile and then each of boxes is like a climate that quantile long-term average precipitation for per the year. Okay. And then in the colors here, colors that are representing in this graph is what moisture deficit looks like for the individual fires in that climate space. So these are forests down here, and they burn with forests. But you could instead have area burn, fraction time itself, burn, average fraction, cell burn, with something like that, burn versus the temperature.
Hey, David and Nancy? It's 11:30, so most people are back in their room.
Okay, we will be down in a minute.
Thanks.
Like the vegetation type.
Yeah. Great. If everybody could come back to their seats, and it seems like we had a lot of really good conversation, which is exactly what we're looking for. So we'll spend about 5 minutes going through and summarizing what people learned in their breakout sessions. So Andy, do you want to go first with the climate tools?
Okay, the Climate Tools group had some great discussions. I'll just hit on a few of the points that came out and I can remember, and then Susan will pitch in. So among how people have been using CalAdapt to date and some of the issues they've been having, one mention was that one group had some issues with managing large files, which is not unique to CalAdapt, but that was an issue in terms of transferring the data between collaborators. There was an example where data came as rasters, and for the analysis it would have been easier to work with vector data, so some data format issues specific to inundation, and the inundation depth values they either were not there or they got lost in the data conversion process. So that was kind of a technical issue they had to deal with. The importance of understanding the uncertainty in the models is important for utilities that are planning on 50 to 100-year time horizons, as well as just sort of the averages, again in reference to inundation. There was a mention of the importance of being able to go beyond just sort of overlaying and visualization of different layers, but also tools to either fuse the data or to consistently, consistent symbolization of different sort of standard types of risk levels would be helpful. Also differentiating the difference between extreme weather events and just sort of a consistent rise in sea levels and inundation, which have different sort of management responses. A couple people mentioned issues with migrating from CalAdapt 1.0 to 2.0, both in terms of having to recode some of the data or the workflow, as well as educating agency staff and people working with the data about the CalAdapt 2.0 has many new scenarios. The downscaling is an improvement, but there's a need for education and maybe some user guidance on how to migrate older projects to the new 2.0, as well as other planning processes which have not yet been integrated with CalAdapt. So some of the more traditional projections of historical climate patterns. So there's some needs there. Many people like the fact that CalEnviroScreen is now available in CalAdapt 2.0. There was an interest in being able to disaggregate the measures of risk that are embedded within CalEnviroScreen, and specifically the socioeconomic and demographic factors from the pollution exposure factors. Those are sort of like the two main dimensions of CalEnviroScreen. And there was a feeling that would be helpful to be able to work with those separately within CalAdapt. Many people use CalAdapt for siting projects, including long-term infrastructure planning. So the ability to do siting analyses that involve multiple criteria, multiple different types of risk and risk management would be very helpful. And then finally, there was an expression of a wish list to be able to bring into CalAdapt any other types of spatial layers, such as hazard mitigation plans at various scales and any other kind of data. So again, to be able to use the other data layers in CalAdapt 2.0 as well as the visualization tools, and if those, to the degree that those can be work with other kinds of overlays, that was a feature that somebody thought would be helpful. Susan, today you can elaborate?
Thank you so much. There were just a couple more things I noted, and one was, it was mentioned from one of the utilities that it would be nice to have some representation of how air conditioning penetration might change and might impact their demand forecasting. Also, some representation of atmospheric rivers. A number of people flag that as interesting, but exactly how to parameterize that, we'd still like more input. And then also one of the utilities would like more stream flow data in areas where they specifically have dams. And the last thing I noted in small was having some kind of heat island effect overlay where we could look at extreme heat in areas that already are suffering from urban heat island effects.
Well, thank you both. Thanks, Andy and Susan. Andy, you took much better notes than I did, so mine's going to be a lot shorter. I do want to mention, especially to those people who are listening in on WebEx, we will be writing these notes up, to sort of clarifying it and putting it in a single document, which we'll make available. I don't know how that works with WebEx, but we will make that available to folks. So we will clean this up a little bit. And we were in the wildfire group. As I mentioned, I'm not as good a note taker as Andy, but we were lucky enough to have, our primary researcher, Leroy Westerling, with us. So a lot of what we talked about was the actual data set. So that was really helpful. So we talked about a couple data sets that we could still visualize on CalAdapt. One which Leroy mentioned is a raw annualized data, which is something that we'll try to look into and see if that's something we can visualize. We talked about the severity layers that Leroy's team is working on, and we've got a little bit of clarification about what that severity is. He's doing some work around a severity measure, which is a 90% basal area burned. So that is something that we could, if there's enough interest, also have on CalAdapt. So that would be a specific severity measure. We talked about emissions as well. So they are able to create a layer that's looking at the emissions based on land cover type for fires. So I know that's something that there's been interest in as well, having that emissions. Something I learned today also is that there is some historical observed wildfire data. I think currently on CalAdapt we're showing model data, but we will be able to add in some historical observed data. And then we talked a lot about the visualizations and some of the charting things that people might be interested in seeing. There was a lot of interest in looking at timing of fire season. So something, akin to what we have in the extreme heat tool that allows you to look at how that seasonality of fire season is projected to change. So that's the type of visualization that I think we can add in. We talked about things like looking at the number of large fires by month, which also could be interesting. Again, there was interest in looking at the fire season length and distribution. Also, some interest in looking at comparisons with baseline. So once we have that, observed historical, we can look at the difference in projected wildfire. So that's something that we're very interested in also. So a comparison between a baseline area burn versus projected into the future, so a difference type layer. And then there was also some interest in looking at multivariate information, particularly looking at vegetation changes in relationship to wildfire projections. So that's something we need to think a little bit more about how we might do that kind of thing, but those were some of the things that people mentioned that they were interested in. And I'm sure I forgot something. David, do you have anything to add to that, or anyone else? Anything that I didn't cover that you're interested in? Okay, great. Well, thank you. And then the next group, Sonia and Vito's group.
Thanks, Nancy. So our group is tiny but very productive. So I have a lot of notes. That said, I'm going to keep this pretty short, and then I'll give you and Susan the detailed notes later. So the main, I think, area that people expressed, and this was across the board, is that there needs to be some guidance on how to use the models and data in CalAdapt. People were thrilled that there was so much information, but a little bit lost on what to do with it, and want some assurity that they're, for example, if they're helping a city with a climate adaptation plan, that they're doing it in a way that is rigorous and accurate. So whether or not they should use 10-year averages or averages at all, etc. One very specific comment is that when you take after putting all your inputs in CalAdapt, so it's like you want an extreme heat day for a specific gridded cell, and then you want to put that in your bibliography, the link back to it actually goes back to the initial CalAdapt defaults rather than any of the parameters that you've selected. And so that's a problem for consultants when they're writing their reports. For stream flows, there's a host of new variables to consider and new research to be done, and I think we're going to have a couple of follow-up meetings separate from this on that with the State Water Resources Control Board and DWR. And in about 6 months' time, we'll have a lot more information from Caltrans about what they need from CalAdapt or things like CalAdapt. They're currently undergoing they just kicked off a contract to take a look at all of their business practices to figure out where climate change is being incorporated and where it isn't and how it can be done better. So as that project goes on, we'll learn more about how they can be using this. Thank you. You know anything else to add? Nope. Okay.
Thanks for all the feedback so far. It's really, as a developer, it's really useful to hear from users. It doesn't happen enough sometimes. So we had some great stuff that came up. One of them was adding the extreme heat as a data set to the API. So right now that's all done on the fly, like in the application. So if other people want to use that, they have to redo that on their end. So it seems like this would help people out. And then some way to do bulk uploads or downloads of all the data that's in there. So say you have a batch of multiple points and you want to send that away and say, intersect, all the values at these locations, and maybe you have a lot of them. And let's see. So then touching on something that came up earlier too, urban heat island effect. So it sounds like that would be useful for folks to have addressed or visualized in some way. And then also addition, I think, of the Cosmos data, which was around in the previous iteration, and those were kind of highlighted as being useful for adaptation planning, in addition to tree canopy cover. And then the other thing, let's see, being able to do like line intersections. So right now we just do sort of polygons where we do a spatial aggregation over a polygon area, but looking at things like road networks and then transmission lines, things like that, being able to get the values for particular segments and things would be of interest. And then one kind of cool thing that came up too was having a tool where you can interactively sort of draw a line or a shape, whatever geometry it is, and then seeing like on the raster grid which cells you might get back. So you have some sort of visual feedback on your interaction directly with the raster data, and it kind of makes a connection there that I thought could be interesting to pursue. So that's about it. I forgot anything.
Well, thanks everybody. This was some really awesome feedback. As Brian mentioned, this is something as developers that we probably don't do as much as we should. You know, it's really helpful to get feedback from people who are actually using the tools. So again, this is a lot of really valuable information for us. As we mentioned, we will compile these notes and make them available to people. You know, and what we're going to do with this information is sort of look through it, think about some things that are, you know, high priorities for us to add into our current tools, and we'll certainly think about some of the new things that people have brought up. Of course, we do, you know, we can't do everything, but I think that there's a lot that we've learned from this meeting that we will be able to implement on CalAdapt. And it's great, you know, please do keep thinking of things that might be valuable for us. I'll probably be sending out a survey to some of the people or to all the people that are in this audience to get a little bit more feedback. So if you know, have some time to think about it between now and then, we'd be happy to get your input on a survey as well. So we really appreciate your time. Thanks again for coming. We will have the afternoon session. We'll start at 1, so we have a little bit of a time to go to lunch and then come back and learn more about the Adaptation Clearinghouse. So I hope to see most of you then. And Susan is going to tell us about a few, I know we only have an hour for lunch, so Susan's going to share with us a couple local choices that are very close by for a quick lunch. And thanks again. We really appreciate your feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy, and everyone at the Geospatial Innovation Facility. There's a sandwich shop. Laboo is O and 11th. That's just 2 blocks east. There's also food at R and 11th. There's a sandwich salad, whatever, and like a Hawaiian-style fish. So I would recommend people go to R and 11th or O and 11th. Right.
Is
the million food trucks.
Right? Is the afternoon meeting going to be on WebEx?
It is. The afternoon meeting is at the same appointment. I'm just going to put up a sign in the room that says we'll be back at 1. But if you're logged in, it's the same information.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll see everybody at 1 o'clock sharp. Thanks. Do you want me to welcome you? Okay, hi, thanks everyone for being here for the afternoon portion. I'd like to welcome Louise Bedsworth from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research.
Great, thank you everyone. So I am Louise Bedsworth. I'm the Deputy Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. We're responsible for the implementation of Senate Bill 246 through the integrated, which creates the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program. And so we're here this afternoon following on the CalAdapt workshop from this morning to talk about the development of a clearinghouse of information that we're building out under this program. So I think we'll start with just going around the small group here in the room, go around who is in the room. I'll walk through the program a little more, and then I think instead of breaking out, we're just going to try to we're going to work our magic and have one big conversation, and I'll talk a little bit why we think that is probably a better idea too coming up. So why don't we quickly go around, I guess folks just speak in your outside voice and maybe people on the phone will hear you. Is that going to be an issue? Okay, or here, we can just pass this along. Okay.
Okay, this is Susan Wilhelm from the Energy Commission.
I am Andy Lyons from UC Division of Ag and Natural Resources.
Hi, I'm Alexis Robert with Hatch Urban Solutions.
Kerry Garcia with the Local Government Commission.
Hi, I'm Shruti Mukhtiar with the Berkeley Geospatial Facility.
Jesse Knapstein with PG&E.
Helen Arvin from the Local Government Commission.
I'm Nancy Thomas, and I'm from UC Berkeley's Geospatial Innovation Facility.
Brian Gailey from Geospatial Innovation Facility as well.
All right, Sam Diaz, Governor's Office of Planning and Research.
Margaret Cooper with California Office of Emergency Services.
Matt Hennigan from Government Operations Agency.
Jake Pollock from Strategic Energy Innovations.
Esther Sudri, State Lands Commission. Greg Iro with the UC A&R California Naturalist Program.
Hi, my name is Greta Seuss. I'm with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research.
No, I think, do we want, can we have, sorry. So Susan's going to unmute folks on the phone. Yeah, folks want to introduce themselves. If you have the list in front of you, we could attempt to go alphabetically down the list. Alicia, are you there? Can we hear you? No. Call in user 9. Oh, okay. Okay. So it looks like we have a lot of that. Okay, so maybe we'll move on. But, okay. Folks on the phone, if you want to chime in, we're monitoring that and we can see that. So feel free to pop up a message, right? Is that the best way, Susan? Okay. Okay, great. So just I'll start with a little quick background. I imagine many of you in the room are familiar with what we're trying to do here, but just to get everybody on the same page. I mentioned Senate Bill 246, which created the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program within OPR. That bill also directs the California Office of Emergency Services to update the Adaptation Planning Guide at a regular frequency. But I think the main intention and the important goal for this legislation was to really work on how do we integrate action across scale, so from local, regional, and state levels, to support putting adaptation actions in on the ground. So this, the intention of this legislation was really to create a two-way street between local, regional governments and state agencies to do this work. And there are two primary components that for OPR's responsibility under the legislation. One is the formation of a technical advisory council, which we have that meets quarterly. It includes local government representatives, regional government representatives. We have some utilities on that, as well as some other non-governmental organizations, and then state agencies. That group is working on a couple of topics. One is developing some vision and principles for the state's adaptation work that we can ultimately lead to sort of some goals and benchmarks for understanding our progress and how we're doing at the local level, at the regional level, and at the state level. So we're working on that right now. We also have a work stream that folks are very interested in on financing adaptation activities. That one is, we've been still working to figure out what exactly does that look like at this point, and there's a number of various efforts underway that we're really looking to coordinate through that work. I think one of the ways the Technical Advisory Council will really engage on that is through how we present that information and those tools and resources in the clearinghouse. So that brings me to the second part of Senate Bill 246, which is the development of a clearinghouse for to provide information, resources, access to data to support climate adaptation activities. The primary users of the clearinghouse are likely to be local government agencies, but we also imagine it is something that state agencies could access and use to understand what is happening on the ground. Utilities could use it. It could provide a resource to answer questions that may be coming to utilities already. And so I think that is something we're really trying to think about as a broad user base. Like I said, we've started with a real focus on local governments. At OPR, we work a lot on providing guidance to local governments on planning, on environmental review. And so, this will support that effort, but then also help just with what other state agencies, private entities, NGOs, et cetera, are doing. So to do that, to develop the clearinghouse, we've been holding a series of user needs assessments and through a couple of different venues, just understanding what is it that people would like to see, how do they imagine using a clearinghouse like this, do they have information they would like to provide to the clearinghouse, and then, and I know with this being at the Energy Commission and we have a couple of utilities in the room, I know utilities are often places where people come for information. And so also thinking about how can the clearinghouse sort of help with that. So that's really the big buy. So we are working to have a beta. We're working with UC Berkeley and the team here in the room to build out the clearinghouse, which will have several components to it. We want to make it connect with CalAdapt, and so we will talk about that and how that connection and how these two things should work together. But we also want it to be something that can stand on its own. We will be pointing out to resources, both directly or resources that are housed on other databases. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Climate Resilience Toolkit or Georgetown Climate Center's databases. And so we'll be really working to aggregate and connect and point out to information. Our primary focus will be on work that is happening in California. We want it to be something that is searchable and accessible so that you can understand, people can enter the clearinghouse and access information according to their needs. So it could be that they want to understand things happening in their region. It could be they want to understand what's happening with a given impact or in a given sector. But also, maybe they want to understand how are people addressing climate adaptation through a general plan or through CEQA, or how are they implementing Senate Bill 379, which requires you to integrate climate risk into the safety element of your general plan. So we really want to make this usable and sort of work with different users' types of needs. So our goal is to have a beta developed in early 2018. And then as I look out, and then we can continue, sort of have a second round of conversations around how that works and how is it working, what is it missing, what does it need, what's great and perfect and wonderful, and what maybe needs a little more work. And so that will be coming up in 2018. So at this point, we're still really working with a bit of a blank slate to just understand what folks would like to see, again, or what they want to contribute, or other things like that. So initially, we had intended to have the day proceed through a set of breakout groups covering 4 topics, and then come back together. One thing we have found in doing these user needs assessments is there's a lot of overlap between these groups. And since we have a small group here today and folks on the phone, we thought let's try sticking together and having the conversation all together with everybody in one room. If folks wanted, we could also, I look at my Energy Commission colleagues, we could probably circle the chairs a little bit so everybody could look at each other and have a more interactive discussion, which might be nice. And then what I'll try to do is just guide us through what we would have had as breakout groups. So initially, the way we've done it is we've had one group talk about case studies, stories, and examples. So this could be the first topic we go through. So what do you want to see? What is available? How can we develop that content to be most useful? The next is tools and resources. So what is available that we should be including in the clearinghouse? Then another on policies and guidance. So information that is available to help support policy development, to implement requirements, et cetera. And then the last topic, Nancy and I discussed right before this, we have listed on the agenda as talking about the CalAdapt API and custom tool development. It sounds like that was covered in some detail this morning. So we thought maybe we would change that last topic to really dig in on how the clearinghouse and CalAdapt should work together, how we would like to see those linkages occurring from something very mundane in terms of like have a very clear link between the two to maybe something that is a little bit more interactive or dynamic. And so we'll just walk through that, and the reason I think it'll be nice to be all in one room is you don't have to choose just one of those to focus on, but there tends to end up being a lot of overlap. So when we are talking about case studies or examples or stories, people are often like, well, that really relates back to this tool or to this policy guidance, and so we don't have to be kind of quite as siloed. So does that sound okay with everybody? Any suggestions or questions? Oh. Okay. 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 So do we want to make a little bit of a more interactive structure for ourselves? This is a team building activity. Or I can do them up here too. Okay. Oh, okay. So I can just share screen? Yes. All right. Okay. 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 Yeah. So what I'll do is I will kick this off quickly, and then maybe we can pass the mic to make it so we're engaging to folks also on the phone. I will try to record quickly as we're talking so that we have just a running list. So just to give folks a sense, if you go to OPR's website right now, there is a placeholder for the clearinghouse. And it is just a placeholder. Great things are coming. And so we've linked to a few things right now already. I mentioned the Georgetown Climate Center's Clearinghouse, work of the Local Government Commission, the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. We'll be continuing to add information. We have been working on some case studies, which tend to be a more in-depth look at specific examples. But we'll also be pointing out to, like I said, case studies existing on other sites, and we will also just be pointing to resources. So where maybe we don't build out an entire case study, but we just point to a good example. And so I guess I'll just kick it off with the discussion questions, and then hopefully we can have a conversation. So basically, the question are, what types of case studies or stories would be most useful to support your climate adaptation efforts? How can case studies or stories be used as communication tools? So not just to support potential actions you're taking, but maybe it's something you want to be able to use to engage the public or someone else you interact with. So there's a long list in the agenda. We've been really thinking about how we make sure that when we put something into the clearinghouse, people can find it. So we've been thinking a lot about keywords and tags. So what are useful tags and keywords that we should be including? And so you can imagine we probably have some that are pretty obvious, like maybe sea level rise or SB 379 or something like that. But it'd be helpful to know what would be useful to you. What are some of the current needs that you have been hearing from tribal, local, and regional entities when you're working on climate adaptation and resiliency planning? So what are you hearing, and is there a way that the clearinghouse could help to provide some of that information? And then also, do you have suggestions on, as I mentioned, we're doing some of these more in-depth case studies, and they do take a bit more work because we try to do it by actually talking with different folks who are involved and writing it up in a more complete way. And so I'd love suggestions on case studies or stories or examples that you feel like would be helpful for us or interesting for others to learn more about through the clearinghouse. And like I said, this could bleed into some of the other topics, but we'll start with talking about sort of the case study stories and examples, and then we'll go into more into tools and resources and on from there. Does anyone want to kick it off?
Hi, it's Elena Hartman from the Water Boards, and just to tag into the tag guidance from EOB 3015, I think this is draft, almost to be published. I came in late, so Louise maybe talked about it, but there is a matrix. I have a copy of it. I think in terms of tags for keywords, it may be useful to have tags that correspond to this matrix. So, for example, you know, you can figure out really what would be a cut. But for me, I'm looking at impact of disruption. It could be low, medium, high, or nature of disruption. It's irreversible. Economic impact is high. So if I could search some of these case studies or examples, and I'm just interested in the ones of what do they deem to be high disruption, you know, maybe just to see how did somebody respond to something that's medium or lower risk and things like that. I think in general mirroring something, if I'm trying to follow the guidance, how would I then trace that back to some examples that specifically, you know, corresponds to some of these key measures. So.
Guido, would you like to go?
No, I was going to.
Oh. Okay, all right, this is Adam Smith with Southern California Edison. I think I would love for Southern California Edison to do something so wonderful that it gets dropped into the clearinghouse as a sterling example of, you know, how climate adaptation should work in the energy sector. But getting that out of the way, I think using this as a communications tool, or at least like I think you brought up a great point, that local jurisdictions are going to have to do their own climate adaptation planning, or at least weave this into their general plan in some way. We're here talking about the energy sector, and it seems to me that all of those local jurisdictions are going to be interested in what either the utilities or the energy agencies at the state level are doing and how they're working together to hopefully either grab something from us. I mean, I don't think that these, you know, local jurisdictions, maybe the larger ones who are slightly more technically savvy, could do some of their own vulnerability analysis on the energy infrastructure in their jurisdiction. But for the most part, I think they're going to rely on us a lot. And so I don't know if this is I guess maybe what I'm asking for is, like, it'd be really great if we could have some story, some case study of a specific city and how that city reached out and used, you know, kind of worked with the utility to understand the vulnerability of the energy infrastructure that served that community. And I think I'd imagine you're probably going to be doing something like this on a much larger scale anyways for folks as they're implementing, I guess, 379, I can't remember the bill, but really having something like this online so that we could all point to it. I mean, we serve about 160 cities, I think, as the last count. So having a place like this online where I could be like, hey, this is really great. This city did it in a really really good way, and we'd like to kind of use this model again with you guys. And then, like, we could take it from there. We could, like you said, we could kind of give them, you know, this is our vulnerability analysis. This is what our resilience strategy is. But just having some kind of example out there in the world of how other cities have interacted with utilities would be really helpful. I don't have a city yet. I'm being honest. I mean, I think we have. I don't know if there's other.
So we're skipping around now, but for a resource, so we've gotten a lot of data requests from various entities for different iterations of whatever planning that they're trying to do. And the problem is there's no standard for these people to request data from the utilities, and they actually sometimes don't even know what they need, so they end up asking for a huge data dump that's cumbersome to us and them to figure out what they need. So if there was some sort of tool or resource, like a template on this website that says, like, if you're trying to evaluate the resiliency of the assets in your district, these are the types of metrics that you will need, this is what you should ask for from the utility, that would give them a template to use, and it would also give us a heads up on what we need to have prepared for them so that we don't have to scramble around for 6 weeks trying to figure out who has what because everybody's asking for different levels of information. So I don't know if that's a case study or like a template or tool.
And so, I mean, this is stumping for stuff that isn't mine, but PG&E does a really great kind of like community grant where they like fund, can't remember how much it is. It's like they give away like $1 million a year to local communities to plan for certain whatever climate, scenarios or extreme events, whatever. It makes a ton of sense to me. Like if PG&E, I'm advocating, for you guys to do something right now, if you could do something more holistically like that with one of the jurisdictions that you've given cash to or given a grant to, it could be a super helpful model for the rest of us engaging with cities.
Okay, I guess I'll chip in. So I am Esther Isudri. I work at the State Lands Commission as a Sea Grant Fellow. We aren't really an agency in the energy sector. However, we do have an interest in the clearinghouse. We do have an interest in providing resources and information on climate adaptation. So a lot of what we do, we plan on a parcel level, to be honest. We plan at the very, very local level. So we are a state agency, but we interact with people on the ground, and that can range from an entire community to just a local mom and pop marina. I mean, it really varies. It could be just like a family or a marine oil terminal. So for us, it's quite difficult when it comes to planning, especially for climate change, climate impacts, vulnerability assessments, and adaptation, because our parcel, it's a parcel by parcel level, so it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. So for us, types of case studies or stories that would be most useful would really be stories driven at the community level by people on what's affecting them and learning about what information they need to best help us find the resources to point them to, because it's really tough to figure out what, a parcel of land ownership would need in Southern California and then maybe up in Northern California. There's just, these impacts are localized, so understanding the differences of these parcels are really going to help us plan better. So what we do in terms of climate adaptation currently is we're a leasing agency, we're a land management agency, so when we receive lease applications, we analyze the lease for sea level rise vulnerability and try to give our best, most holistic assessment of vulnerability to climate change impacts and then include that in our staff report. So what would really take that to the next level is if we can start including more concrete recommendations and adaptation strategies for these local folks to build into our staff reports that go into lease measures. We're not there yet, but that really is our hope, that we've got a long way to go because it's tough planning at the parcel level. Okay, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. I guess I'll just add while the mic is in my hand. Louise had mentioned this, but I want to clarify for folks even more that there's really there's sort of like a level of phasing that we're doing in collecting these and creating these case studies. So
We have been doing case study creation, just reaching out to locals that we think are doing good work, but we've really been trying to dial it back and really get a holistic view of examples of, for example, a list of all of the CAPs in California that include adaptations, and then really going through and saying, really briefly, why is this an important resource? And then, moving from there, once we have a really good list of a lot of examples out there that we can point to, then taking a deeper dive into some of the examples that we think would be useful in creating a larger, more in-depth case study. So we have this sort of examples list, and we're developing case studies that have more detail in them that, cover the funding, the partnerships, the, resources, the science used, et cetera, challenges and things like that. And then we have also our partnership with UC, and our contract with UC is allowing us to develop the stories that you had mentioned, wanting to see in the more community-driven, learning through communities and those sort of. So those are sort of the three different categories of things that we're working on collecting right now. So I just wanted to sort of clarify that for folks if that would be helpful. Yeah, well, so the examples list that we are trying to build into the database right now, we're at the very early stages of this, but looking to host examples that have links already to existing documents or pages that even have been highlighted on other websites as a summary of what this project did, but doesn't have the full, a full deep dive on what it was. Just having that resource there and being able to link to it is ideal for us right now, but we also have a different list of things that don't have, we know this exists, but there's no online, there's no way to tell aside from, knowing the organization or the person that had worked on the project. And so we have a separate list for examples that fall into that bucket, but we're definitely planning on, using both of those lists to go back in and look at, where are the what are the things that rise to the top that, in comparison to all the other examples have, something that would be useful to highlight in a more in-depth case study. And in those cases, it might be that it already does exist online somewhere, or it doesn't, and we're going to have a separate conversation like we have been doing to really build out a case study. But I think it is helpful to have the fully implemented projects. Obviously, being an adaptation clearinghouse, everything having to do with adaptation is constantly evolving, and there's no, once a finished project isn't really finished until you really see the outcomes, and in the case of adaptation, that can be, 50 to 100 years. So we're constantly, we're going to need to be doing updating on this resource. But I think having plans that are completed or projects that are fully or close to being completed in terms of implementation are most helpful. But I mean, if you have other thoughts on that, please note that.
To try to bring it back to your original question, to the extent that the tags can help us reduce duplication in work would be very beneficial, I think, especially given that there's a lot of EPIC grants that are constantly being funded, and the utilities are not able to sort of keep up with the amount of work coming out of there. So to the extent that old EPIC grants and new EPIC grants can be integrated into the system and tagged, and potentially work that, I know that your work was an EPIC-funded grant, so that would be included, but the PG&E, for example, is doing a lot of resiliency work that is not public anywhere because it's internal work that we do, but because of that, there's been some EPIC grants that are a little bit redundant that have been popping up. And so to the extent that we as utilities can make our internal research publicly available and tag it, at least to tell you the titles of what we're working on and potentially even some of the outcomes without releasing any private information. I think that would be beneficial and target EPIC funding potentially better. Yeah, or just like if you were a city, for example, and you needed information and we have a tool for that, but you never knew that we had a tool for that. So like just letting you know that it's out there, for example, so then you can come to us and ask for your confidential information and we can give it to you, right? We can't give it to everybody. So. I mean, literally you could just come to us and say, what are you doing on resiliency? And I can give you the names of what we're doing and tag it myself. You know what I mean? Yeah, sure. Yeah, and that would, I think that would go a long way to helping us collaborate more and spend our money wisely. Everybody.
I'm just bringing the mic over to Adam, but want to say titles is an excellent idea because sometimes having a fully fledged completed project can stand in the way of things getting out there, and fully vetted by, for example, a state agency could stand in the way of getting out there. But if there is something in progress that you could build off of or collaborate on or somehow share some information, even if it's not completed, could be very useful to avoid duplication concurrently working on the similar stuff, not to mention already finished stuff. So titles, at the minimum, you know, like a separate thing. It's not a full description, a case study, but it really, I think, would be helpful.
Actually, I think my comment kind of builds or is like directly related to that because I'm kind of a little nervous about some of like only going after, and I don't think this is what you were insinuating, but kind of like going after like fully baked projects or like things that are done, because there's so much that is kind of, honestly just kind of like kicking off. I'm thinking about that advanced energy community kind of project that the CEC has funded, I think, pilot development, and then later on they'll potentially look at those pilot, or I guess, you know, the program design and suggest if they could actually get program funding to implement these things. But I mean, this is like squarely at disadvantaged communities, you know, who are going to see extreme heat events and all these other things, and packaging some form of solutions like, you know, deep energy efficiency and targeted locations, like kind of mixed in with community solar. And to me, that's something that's a pilot. It's happening, but it's like a really promising potential model. And it'd be really great if that didn't just live in between the CEC and the utilities and some of the county partners, but instead could be something that cities and jurisdictions could see as kind of like a best practice. And so like that's where I'm like, yeah, I'm with you. Like you probably want some of the stuff that's baked, but there's also these things that I think probably have a lot of support, or at least are on issues that are so topical and important. Like anybody who's in a disadvantaged community or like represents a disadvantaged community who sees this CalAdapt data set is going to be like, well, what can I do here? And I think like having at least a few, even if they're preliminary answers to that question online in the clearinghouse, could be super helpful.
I think I'm building off that as well, but being able to categorize some of these things, so having, you know, stages of where you're at in your development. So like you said initially, it's not going to be very many people with, you know, completed projects, but you could at least have, okay, this is step one, and start categorizing it by if you are a disadvantaged community, if you are this, if you're located in Southern California, Northern California, and it starts guiding you through the whole process of what was done in your specific area. But then you could still, you know, okay, well, let me see what's going on in Northern California. I can see they're doing things a little differently based on their climate and other things. And then also on your first comment, be able to guide some of it to specific language, say like a model ordinance. I mean, hopefully everybody has, you know, adaptation in their general plan updates, so they're likely not going to, there's going to be a few that aren't. And so they may need to start all the way back at the beginning and put the actual language in there and start building from scratch that way. So I think just having it very clearly identified on where do I get started, not just jumping straight in on a super advanced project that they may not have any ability to relate to.
So, Alexis Robert with Hatch, as someone who works with local governments and agencies on adaptation and climate planning, not directly the energy sector in this case, but it seems to me that there's almost two roles, and I'm curious if the clearinghouse is planning on playing both. One in terms of collecting best practices and case studies that highlight key best practices, and another that would provide just list, more of like a clearinghouse of all of the adaptation plans that cities have done in the state of California, all of the integrated climate adaptation plus mitigation plans, et cetera, so that if I am working with a city in the East Bay and I want to see that another city, if I'm working with the city of Alameda, let's see what the city of San Leandro has done, I can certainly go to the city of San Leandro's website, but if there's, and I don't know if this is within your scope, but if there's a way of seeing all of, very quickly, what has been done on these different topics, adaptation, hazard planning, et cetera, even if they're not considered best practice, and then of course you can cull the top models, I think people I work with would find that quite useful.
Is to try to build those lists. I think we can do some easier than others, but yeah, to be able to say, and then where we can, also maybe without doing a full-blown case study, be able to highlight what's interesting about something versus, there are not that many climate action plans that include adaptation right now, so we can pull all of those together, but also we want to be able to say, here's a general plan that had a really neat community engagement strategy, or something like that. So we're not saying this is the gold standard of how you should do everything, but also try to curate it in some way that you would know what's interesting or what's a neat place to focus in an otherwise very big document or something like that. So, and then from that, I think talking about the case studies is, yeah, we can sort of say, let's look at this one in more depth because of whatever, and so we have a diversity of location, of impact, but also we're highlighting, different ordinances or requirements or things like that. So I think we will try to do both the best we can.
Are we just jumping around on the agenda now? Are we trying to stick with things? Okay. Yeah.
There are remaining questions on the other topic areas on the agenda. I have
Okay. Well, you can tell me if this is too far off of base. But along the lines of kind of unifying all of the local agencies and the utilities and everybody who's working on this along the same metrics, you said that you were planning on coming up with benchmarking goals within the Tech Advisory Committee for trying to figure out how we're doing on our climate resiliency efforts. And internally, I know at PG&E and I assume at the other utilities, we're looking for climate resilience metrics to start using to track our own success in this work. And it would be great if we were all using the same metrics. So to the extent that we can coordinate on that or we can get guidance would be very helpful. Yep. So.
My question is regarding your comment about synthesizing the information for a lot of these plans that are going to be, put on the database, like calling out specifics as to why this adaptation plan might be, interesting for this city. Is that type of, and I guess, synthesis going to be done relative to, I guess, the impacts that city might necessarily be most vulnerable to? Like, for example, if you're synthesizing information from a climate action plan in a coastal city, that's going to be different if you're in an, an inland city on a floodplain or something like that. So I was just wondering if there was a method to that, or if that was just like a general idea that.
Yeah, I was gonna add. So, I mean, I don't get too into the details of this, but for each of the resources and the examples that we're collecting, we're tagging them by like a lot of the ones that are on this list. So they, like if you're looking, if we're highlighting a cap, like it probably spans all of the impacts, but it's not, I mean, I think that covers already, like being able to have it tagged by the impacts or the sectors or whatever. I think that probably covers your question already. And then, yeah, I don't know, because otherwise we would be basically writing up a full case study to cover that information.
What do you mean by calling out pieces of information? I guess I just wanted to know what you meant by that specifically, because different adaptation plans will serve a community different based on those impacts, right? So if a city has a hazard mitigation plan, it will cover all of the impacts, but some of those impacts will be felt more in that city. So that's the sort of information that should be focused on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of a hard thing to balance, especially when we're, like, ideally that, that's a gold standard, but I think given the vast amount of resources that we are trying to host, that, that I think that could be a goal, but there is definitely like, a level of like how much, because that's a really hard thing to learn, like if you're looking at this giant list of hazard mitigation plans, like how, is someone like creating this sort of resource supposed to know all of those like really nuanced details of the plan, so.
Well, I just meant like this city is in, on the coast, so you should focus on the coastal resources of this plan, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Not necessarily something more general, but. And I think our goal is to have information that if the user knows their needs better, you'll be able to. Okay. More than us trying to determine the needs of the We're trying to anticipate, broadly speaking, but then that they can say, okay,
I'm a coastal city. I probably am going to have more in common with a hazard mitigation plan from another coastal city and maybe not a community in the Sierra Nevada. You might have some, maybe like I really want to learn about fire. Yeah, or I don't know. So I think a lot of it's going to be user driven, and so we're trying to balance, put enough in there that the user can find what they want according to their need without us sort of trying to anticipate or guide them a certain way. Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify the resiliency grant that Adam mentioned earlier that PG&E is hosting actually just got awarded our first round last week. So you guys can look up the report on that if you want. And our plan so far is to just choose areas of climate impacts and every year give grants away to 2 organizations around those. So this year we chose wildfires, and one went to UC Davis, I believe, and the other went to a local tribe. And I guess my only point is that those would be great case studies if you're interested. But yeah, and to the extent, I mean, this is a 5-year program, so to the extent that there's input on what you think our carry-on should be, right now we were just going to sort of go down the line of the climate impacts, like sea level rise, subsidence, what have you. So.
So do folks have ideas? Do we want to talk through specific tools and resources we feel like, did folks feel like they were able to cover that there? I mean, basically, some of the questions we have on this are really about how do you or folks that you work with use projections, different tools, data, and information. Are they using things the state currently has, other tools that we should be other data and tools we should be thinking about? There is a list that we have here, where we're thinking about the projections from the fourth climate change assessment, of course, CalAdapt, and other tools such as that, or resources. Are there times where there are where you're finding yourself having to reconcile across different tools? And so that would be one, just sort of more on the data tools side. Are there specific issues that we should be trying to be sensitive to, address, or provide guidance on through the clearinghouse?
At this morning's CalAdapt workshop, we heard a lot about extreme events that are other than sea level rise alone or extreme heat alone. So I'm just going to remind people that they mentioned that and ask them to comment if they wish on definitions of extremes that involve multiple parameters.
I mean, I actually was one of the people that mentioned that, but so to the extent that we use climate resilience data for decision making, it was a lot of the data currently available is around extreme events, and for assets that are there all the time, it would be also helpful to have like blue sky data, so data on sea level rise that does not include the 100-year storm event, or like how you differentiate between extreme event planning versus day-to-day planning.
One other thing we talked about in our group this morning, though I think this might be more for CalAdapt than the clearinghouse, but was the question of interactivity and how the sea level rise decisions on siting, for example, or land use and approval decisions have to take into account, well, if you're going to move upland from sea level rise, are you exposing yourself more to wildfires, or are you going into a floodplain that might involve riverine flooding? And so I think my clients are thinking about where do I put things, or how do I plan ahead, how do I plan for growth, and to the extent that in addition to CalAdapt, the clearinghouse can help respond to those questions of trade-offs and interactivity, I think that would be useful.
I think maybe on the energy side, I actually don't see anything here looking into, projected energy usage for local communities. I think that's a tough thing for the state to do, to get down that granular level, but anything by like PG&E planning, I'm sure you can get that from PG&E or Edison directly, but just guides so people can see maybe what's going on in the IPER, what the projections are for the state, economic projections, getting into like economic, I guess outside the climate stuff, but nonetheless, give you an idea of kind of what your baseline is and what you're working with, and then going from there.
Amber this morning was saying about including energy projections like penetration of air conditioning demand and that sort of thing that kind of bridges the CalAdapt and the policy sides of things.
As a small nonprofit, I think the resources and the funding wizard pieces are really important for us to figuring out what's available to support cities and counties in SB 379 work in particular. And we do that also through a lens of like workforce development, so getting early career folks this kind of training and experience so they, can do this well into the future.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep a sharp focus on the user of this information and the outcomes that they're driving towards. So if it's local governments doing, city planning, if that's the user, then let's give them a vision of what their plan needs to look like and the tools to make it easy to get there. If it's facility owners, large property owners, across the state, then let's give them actionable information that they can use to develop real projects on the ground. And I think that'll dictate kind of what information and guidance is most useful. Yeah, all right, well, I have it. You know, I think, you know, frankly, as I look across, like, I think you have a general sense of how SCE lines up on a lot of these questions. Like, I mean, how we use projections. We've talked about that in early panels. You know, I think, frankly, as you go along, maybe building off the last comment, like, as you go along, and if there are stories you want to tell or you think would be super useful to some of those end users, like, I'm sure SCE or PG&E or every other utility in the state that's thinking about this stuff would probably be really interested in trying to help. Like, I mean, if there's data like on whatever, you know, building energy usage in specific regions, we can find ways to either, you know, get it from the CEC or from us. I think it's like, at least from this utility's perspective, don't view, like, if there's energy sector stories you'd like to tell and the data isn't out there or you don't know how to tell it 100%, feel free to reach out to us because we'd be super happy to help.
I think we just had Shasta County come down and do a brown bag for us, and I think by looking at the tools and resources, I think it's good to imagine, especially local jurisdictions that have to do it all. You know, they do Reading Electric Utility. They have to work with the county health department. It's just they're hit with wildfire, extreme heat, drought. I mean, they said that they were on the cutting edge of it all, and so a lot of these tools and resources. Like the county health profiles has a lot of data. The extreme heat for CalAdapt, I mean, New and Tara said it was 97, and all of them on the panel were like, oh, 97, that would be a nice day. Like, give us that, please. And so it would be really nice just to get, like, a heat response plan as a tool and resource because that's something the local jurisdiction has to do. And so does the heat response plan at the county health department actually correspond with the CalAdapt modeling, or does it respond to someone's cooling at night? So it's, I think, the to-do for OPR for us is just to make sure that the tools and resources are actually it's helpful for social workers, it's helpful for the county, and if the utilities have any advice or if they work with any people who deliver those resources, that'd be really helpful to understand the levers at the local level that you are engaged with, because I think we're in the state level, and so we don't know, kind of a blind spot for us. So that'd be really helpful for us.
I want to mention something that the City of Reading people commented on regarding their climate resiliency planning and adaptation during this brown bag. The question was specific. How did you plan? Did you go to CalAdapt and look up a certain, projection? They said no. We just looked at the slope, the vegetation. Is it too steep? Is it exposed to fire? Is it near water? Is it going to flood? They didn't need to know the specific number of days that it's going to go from 4 to 55 heat days. They kind of used gross resiliency strategies. City trees and urban greening was one of them. So it does not necessarily to them matter how many more heat days they're going to have. Knowing that there's going to be a dramatic increase in number of heat days help them prioritize the strategy to get the urban greening going. But they didn't have to have super accurate, settled change from X to Y number of days. They just decided urban greening is good because it provides shade, streets look nicer, it helps absorb water, retain it more on site, slow the flood water. So I think that was something that really came across from a city that really is on the cutting edge. They're living today something that we're looking for other places. It's going to be our climate change. And so I feel like there's some value just in that thought of multi-benefit thing, even if you don't know exactly what your climate change impact is.
Yeah, that presentation was useful for me too, to realize that these impacts are here today, right? We talked about climate change. There'll be extreme heat. There's already extreme heat. And there are people planning for and adapting to and doing projects about flooding, fire, heat, you name it. So as far as case studies, I mean, these projects are already happening. They might not be about future conditions, but they're about conditions today that will just be more common in the future.
Just building on Jacob's comment about the financing tools, I also wanted to echo that. Well, I actually had a question about how you plan to bring the information from your work stream on financing adaptation into the clearinghouse, the findings from that, and also I see here the funding wizard. I was wondering more, I'm unfamiliar with that, so if you could tell me more what you had in mind for that, but just generally supportive having information about various funding sources is useful.
So here's our dream. Whether we get there, we'll see. So the funding wizard, I'll start there. That's maybe easier answer. That's an existing tool that is housed on Cool California. I'm looking at Liz. Okay. It's ARB, yes. So that exists now. And that really is about, it's trying to help point to state funding resources and state and federal funding resources. So that exists. On the financing piece, we've been doing this, I think as in this group and in the first Technical Advisory Council meeting has come up as probably the biggest need that we hear is more information, well, more money. So we're not making money with the clearinghouse, but also more guidance on how to find funding to do this sort of work and how to finance and fund projects. So I think those are, so what we're really looking at is probably more the latter of ways to finance and fund projects on the ground. And so there's a couple of initiatives that are moving forward right now. Some are work at the state, just trying to better understand the landscape of what's available. There's a project through the Fourth Climate Assessment that is looking at financing for adaptation projects. The San Francisco Bay Development and Conservation, San Francisco Bay, BCDC, is doing a financing, has a financing task force that's moving forward, and they're working with the Resilience by Design project in the San Francisco Bay Area. We've been working with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco on some convenings. We had our first last week. What we would ultimately like to be able to look at is build basically a matrix or framework that just lists what are the types of tools that are available, and then what are the characteristics of a project that might make those tools more viable. So, and really trying to open that lens broadly of public financing and private financing, the way different financial institutions can engage at different phases or parts of a project. That's a huge landscape, and that's why I said I think that's really sort of our ultimate goal that we would like to get to. I think we're still trying to figure out what the timeline of something like that would look like. But just to be able to get things into one place that said, oh, if you have this kind of a project and maybe you're going to have a user fee associated with it, does that open up different types of financing tools to you? Do you have, local, certain types of local bonds, things like that? So it's an area we're still working on, but ultimately just that's kind of what we're trying to get at, which is just a little bit more of an accessible way to look at, who are the institutions you can engage with, what are the types of tools that are available. So, and that could range from grants all the way through to different types of financing.
You can actually go to the site and you can send the information about your program, and we will include that on the Funding Wizard tool.
Programs that we should be sure to highlight. So are there things that you work on a lot with different users? We've mentioned several things around hazard mitigation plans or general plans, climate action plans. We can get specific around SB 379 implementation. So are there specific policies or guidance we should be sure to include in the clearinghouse. Are there topics that you have found are particularly challenging, or where more additional examples, resources would be helpful for implementation? You know, and so just sort of what should we make sure that we include in this range of both processes people might want to look at, but or tools that can help make certain processes, policies, guidance, et cetera, easier to deal with.
So for the question of what needs to be included, that is an open question that's difficult to answer. It was mentioned by my friend here earlier, the interaction effect between some of the different impacts is a huge question for us for planning, and it must be for local communities as well. So just what happens when there's drought and heat waves and wildfires all happening at once, and how should we plan for that? So to what extent are those exacerbated, and what does that mean for planning? So, you know, if there's sea level rise, we can just lift things above the water, but if there's 3, you know, extreme events happening at once, how do we plan for that, and how do we quantify it? And along those lines, I know PG&E has already started asking this question, but what are some resiliency building standards that we can start to incorporate into our infrastructure and asset decisions? And this goes for buildings as well. So there's best practices all over the place, including places that are already feeling the effects of climate change more heavily than we are, places like Hawaii and any island nation really, as to like how to harden their assets or where to build them. And there's actually engineering standards that exist that we are considering, and maybe it would be helpful to, you know, culminate those on your website. So, yeah. So the CPUC mandated the, risk asset management, it's the RAMP filing, which we just underwent, and it will be submitted in the next month, and that includes risks to climate impact, basically, to specifically for safety, so injuries and fatalities, and that is directly tied to like heat and things like that. Yeah, so that's a CPUC proceeding, separate conversation. Yeah. Yeah, but it is being addressed elsewhere. That actually, the RAMP proceeding would actually be a really interesting tool for all the utilities to put on their website as well, because they all have different models for how they did that. Yeah. We used a multiplier, so like added on essentially.
Financing tools, I just wanted to ask if you had heard of resiliency bonds that fall under catastrophe bonds that I think it's, I don't remember what. Has anybody here heard of that? Because I've been exploring it recently at the State Lands Commission, trying to figure out, so for us it's all about how are we going to finance resiliency. We're moving past the impacts and assessing vulnerability because the impacts are now. So we've been trying to look into understanding what, financial mechanisms exist, like from the private sector, like environmental impact bonds and stuff like that. And I was wondering if that information, at least for us, would be useful to include.
Yes, I think that's what we would like to. I mean, we would like to be able to list those as an option, and we've, what level that looks like, because I've talked to folks like in the forestry and watershed, or, but yes, I think ideally, ultimately, we'd like to get to where it's almost like a menu of options, and how you would, why one, recognizing we're not financial advisors, why something might make sense in a given context. Yeah. Any other?
what can you expect? I guess to the metric question, you had $100 million to allocate in your portfolio. What basic elements do you need to see so that you know it's resiliency and you're not getting like a hodgepodge of projects or plans? And like just State Land Commission, what do you commissioners, how do they define that? How is it really helpful for us to include? Because I think people come at it in different ways, like you said.
I just had a question, and it's not focused on this section here, but it's more broadly looking at this broader question about if the audience for the clearinghouse is local government agencies, what role is there for the clearinghouse to increase, enhance, or improve public participation and involvement in the efforts of local government units for climate adaptation and building resilience? And if that is an important role in your work or in the work of local governments, how can the clearinghouse assist with that? Are there mechanisms that you think the clearinghouse may be able to provide that would make the content relevant to the average person so that they could become meaningfully involved in its implementation? Because obviously at some point they've got to be involved in these plans, otherwise they're just written for them. So just a general question, if you have any thoughts on how that might be operationalized through the clearinghouse.
So for us, we see it as sort of a focal of our education and outreach efforts at the Commission. So the State Lands Commission, we have an environmental planning department, we have environmental scientists on staff, and they're the primary staff members that are responsible for doing these climate change analyses and vulnerability assessments and adaptation assessments for local parcels and our public lands that we manage. However, our entire staff isn't well versed in climate change science. So a lot of what I do and my team, what we do is we have this kind of capacity building, education and outreach sort of system where we train our staff to work with local governments and local jurisdictions. So for us, it would really help our efforts internally to communicate with staff so they can better, because they're very, they're not scientists, so they pretty much, they communicate on a very layman's terms. So they need information that would make most sense for them to help them communicate. So for us, it would be useful as more of a capacity building tool to empower staff to help them help our lessees point to information.
Does anyone see the public going directly to the clearinghouse? And if they did, would they find a entry point into useful information for them? And maybe that's not what we're trying to do at all with this, but if you think at some point that would help, you know, we're thinking that these stories might be a possible entry point for people. They see someone like themselves. I'm a small farmer in, you know, this location, and these are the issues that are relevant to me, and these are the things that local governments are doing. I'll just keep that question.
One useful type of policy examples that we could post is building code changes. Changing the state building code is kind of a blunt instrument because it applies statewide, and as we've been talking, this is all so local. But the classic reason for amending a local building code is a specific geographic difference. Why does your building code need to be different than the state's based on your geography? Well, that's exactly what we've been talking about. But there are many cities with similar geography, right? So coastal cities could all copy each other's various provisions of building code. So some type of a clearinghouse, for lack of a better word, right, of examples of local code changes that maybe don't make sense to push through the statewide building commission, but nevertheless could save a lot of work and save each city reinventing the wheel for, you know, new construction and major renovations. You know, that can be actionable, you know, on the ground.
Thanks. I think that sparked, I know PG&E is rolling out the exciting EV charging, $130 million over 3 years. And so it'd be curious to hear, so Edison, I'm sure you're rolling that out too, of how OPR can eliminate, maybe I'm going to get slapped on the wrist for this, but eliminate the soft costs when you go to your city, you know, the desk to get your building permit for the EV installation. How can the state help streamline those, and are there case studies or model ordinances or things that OPR can put into the clearinghouse, and then when we get calls that say, oh my gosh, this city took 9 months and 15 inspections to get one charging station, and that was a lot of soft costs that could have gone into a whole other charging station. You know, that would be really helpful to hear. I don't know if you want to chime in on that. Louise is probably going to slap my wrist on that one when I get back to the office, but that is a lot of phone calls that we get at OPR about, oh my gosh, we just spent $14,000 for one charging station on permits and inspections. This is crazy. So.
Well, if you want the clearinghouse to be horror stories, we have a few, but I mean, like, yeah, we could probably, frankly, we may want to just like, this is on the internet, yeah? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Then I think there are regional examples that are like good ones, like good partnerships between local jurisdictions who have either come up with their own sort of like electric vehicle push, or even regions, maybe slightly larger than just a single jurisdiction, that have kind of made electric vehicle deployment a priority. I mean, you can think about like the city of LA. Maybe it's not even like in my service territory, but I mean, places like that made things a heck of a lot easier for folks installing vehicle chargers. And so, like, you're not going to get, again, we serve 160 cities. We're not going to get every single one of those cities to be as responsive. And frankly, not all of them have the people working around the office building to move quickly on things. So, I mean, I think we could highlight good examples. But I don't, yeah, if you want the horror stories, maybe that could be like the dark side of the clearinghouse or something. While I have the mic, one of the other things I was thinking about, and I talked about half the people in the room about this topic, but it's actually on the back of the policy and guidance handout you had, where you have the 1482, the language. I'm looking down here at number 2. And you're talking, this is obviously directed at state agencies, but you're talking about developing infrastructure to address adaptation where feasible. Project alternatives should be developed that utilizes existing natural features and ecosystem processes. Like, this just has me thinking, there's a lot of things that aren't necessarily energy infrastructure or physical hardening, so making that pole tougher or more heat resistant, that could have beneficial effects on the electricity sector. And so, I'm thinking here about, the Reading example, urban greening, as kind of a climate change solution. Cities, I love them because they have a lot of leeway to think really societally. Obviously, that's their job. Investor-owned utilities have a little bit more of a difficult time making a broader societal case for some of our investments, where, we would have to have a pretty rigorous methodology for understanding if we build, if we do all this urban greening or potentially help fund some of this urban greening in specific locations, how does that impact cooling demand in that same location? It's a great research project. We have someone who can help with that. But, I mean, those are some of the examples. I don't know if there's a good, I'd love to have an example that I could point to where maybe it is the Reading one where, somebody, we could say hey, they didn't necessarily just go out and do things the way they've always known how, which is, hey, there's some weakness in the system. Let's go out there and, reinforce it. Instead, they thought a little bit outside of the box for solutions that had additional co-benefits that are really useful and helpful, but they weren't in the wheelhouse of normal everyday utility guy stuff, Yeah.
Yeah, I actually was going to bring up something really similar, so I might as well just piggyback on that. I don't know if the clearinghouse is where this should be housed, but along those lines, when we're thinking about some of the activities that we're going to undertake to update our design and engineering or harden our assets, we have no idea what the cities are doing around that. And when we're talking about our assets, we're also talking about all the access roads to get to these assets, so that covers a lot of land. And a lot of times the access roads are, for example, like along the seashore in like San Mateo and things like that. And San Mateo is already thinking about what to do because they are at risk for sea level rise. So if they're putting up a wall and we're putting up a wall, that's too many walls. It's one too many walls. So just somewhere where, you know, we have all of the communities' plans sort of broken down into their actual activities, or maybe even like geospatially located so we can see what they're doing or planning on doing in the long run, so that there's not duplication of efforts, because these projects cost quite a bit of money. What was that? Titles, yeah. Yeah, but especially geolocation would be helpful, right? Because the assets are everywhere, and yeah, to the extent that it's a city, I guess you would know where it is. Yeah.
Looking at the time, I'll tee up the last topic, and maybe, I don't know, Nancy, if you want to say a little something. But I think we really want to talk about, we started this conversation a while ago with Susan and with the Energy Commission about how do we build on all of the great information, the amazing tool that CalAdapt is, and is continuing to grow and evolve. And so, you know, we've talked about just simple connections across them, but I think I'll let Nancy speak to it, but just sort of how do we want these two things to work together?
Thank you. Let me just set the stage a little bit and give you all some background information. So as you know, the GIF, we've developed CalAdapt, of course, with funding from the Energy Commission as an energy sector resource. We also, at the GIF, have recently been funded through OPR to build this clearinghouse, the Adaptation Clearinghouse, with a lot of support from our colleagues at ANR. So we're thinking of both of these projects, you know, they're separate funding sources, so they're separate projects. They are definitely linked. I think I may have shown on my demo of CalAdapt that we currently have a linkage to the current existing clearinghouse, and we'll certainly do that in the future as well. And, you know, in the clearinghouse, CalAdapt is one of the tools that's noted in the clearinghouse. So they certainly are linked. I guess as, you know, this conversation is really helpful for us thinking about the clearinghouse. What we're building is the actual database. We're thinking about how, you know, how people can enter into the database, how users can use it, how they can find the information they want. So this has been really helpful for thinking about those types of things. One thing I'm thinking about just after today's talk is that maybe, you know, as I mentioned earlier today with CalAdapt, we have our CalAdapt tools, and then we also have the API that allows people to really build their own custom tools, which is especially, you know, very valuable for local planners and local groups. I'm thinking that maybe one way to sort of help tighten the interlinkage is having some of our user stories about CalAdapt as case studies on the clearinghouse, maybe as ways to help people who want to use that, you know, build their own tools, sort of an entryway into how people could actually go about doing that. So I think maybe having a case study or two would be really great. So then the other thing, you know, we're thinking of is how to link these two. Again, it could be as simple as just, you know, a link on CalAdapt that goes to the clearinghouse and vice versa. But I'd be interested in hearing if you have ideas about other ways that they could be linked more tightly, maybe, if there's something that you think would be useful. And I also sort of like to project into the future. You know, what do you think if funding were available to do more, what do you think would really help people, you know, if they were more tightly interlinked? So those are some of the things that I'm thinking of, if anyone has some ideas. Yeah. Sure.
I think it would be really helpful to have like geospatial tags for what's already happening. So like if to the extent that the community resilience plans have detailed planning that you can put on the map, we can just use the same GIS layers then, plan around it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'll call out Climate Corps too, and just curious. I mean, it would be helpful as your fellows go off and do projects using CalAdapt. I mean, you included it as part of your orientation. It'd be good to get the live feedback of what would be useful, and so maybe that could be. I know they're probably overworked already, but it would be really helpful just to get a few examples out of that program. To see, okay, they're placed at a college or a local government. They're working on adaptation plans or projects using CalAdapt, and so how's that going? So.
Anyone else? Yeah. Yep.
For fellows that are placed in these different cities and counties, what kind of resources are available to them or to the cities and counties for SB 379 planning? Are there like workshops or other ways that they get training, education, kind of the outreach aspect of that? How do we contribute case studies to? Or, okay. Okay.
And then I think the other, well, something I just forgot. It might come back
to me. I wonder if CalAdapt and Clearinghouse could almost serve as a Venn diagram of where the impacts are, which is CalAdapt, and where we have adaptation happening. And so I think during the IPER a couple of weeks ago, it was Adam who mentioned something to the effect that climate work should start with the communities most impacted. And this goes beyond actually the link, how to physically make them speak or communicate or integrate, but also as a screen. There are high vulnerabilities here. There are a lot of people here or valuable resources, and we don't have adaptation there. So I don't even know if this can happen, but if it could be added, kind of like as an analysis, where to focus some of the efforts.
Well, there's a few other resources out there besides CalAdapt. There's a Heat Island Index website that I'm blanking on the name. We've got, CalEnviroscreen. There's another one that tracks tree canopy. Even the Smart Location Calculator from US EPA. for kind of transit-orientedness of various census tracts. So just pointing out those other tools, right, that don't necessarily exist in CalAdapt but are useful for this type of planning could be a good resource to have in the clearinghouse.
Along those lines, one more I don't think I saw here that was, it's regional, but adapting to rising tides, which is the BCDC project. I know it's only, it'd be a lot longer paper if it were.
So I probably should ask this offline. Suppose you get a case study and it doesn't comply, say, with state guidance. How do you have screening criteria?
This is an ongoing challenge for us, I think, is we will obviously have to do quality control for anything that is included. We want to be as inclusive as possible and want to be very clear that by something being in the clearinghouse, it does not mean that we are saying this is how something has to be done, should be done, or it's the best way that it is done. And that comes in, I think it speaks to some of the issues that were raised earlier about their different local jurisdictions need different things, have different priorities, different challenges, et cetera, face different climate impacts. And so I think we need to be very careful about that. So we'll be doing internal quality control, certainly. And I think we would not include something that was not in line with requirements. So we wouldn't want to include a general plan that doesn't meet the most recent legislative requirements for a general plan. That said, there could be something that meets those. That's fine. We don't want to, and we want to include it, but we don't want people to think that, So we're going to have to work through that, and I think so there's some basic screen, and then I think we will add language around, again, also why something, like I said, maybe this has a really interesting community engagement section that's worth taking a look at, or here's a climate action plan that looks at mitigation and adaptation together, or here's just the climate adaptation. So we're highlighting, how those will fit in. And I should have mentioned this earlier. Another piece of legislation that is being implemented by the Ocean Protection Council is AB 2516, and through that, they are inventorying. They are working with UC Berkeley, who is also working with Nancy and folks about compiling information on sea level rise activity. We will be integrating that work together as well. And we're trying to follow a similar protocol and approach that they are, which is being able to point to why, sort of a bit of the curation of why things are included, in addition to sort of this, trying to just be a place where you can go and see climate action plans, general plans, et cetera.
As a recommendation for how CalAdapt maybe can link with this is some of the, I know in this room today we've mentioned 1 million different stakeholder groups, and they all operate in different areas of California and all cover different areas and regions. And I know there's some, and they usually have a lot of information that's relevant to everybody that falls within those regions, but maybe not everybody in those regions knows they are represented by those groups, like ARCA, and there was a bunch on like the regional sea level rise initiatives and things like that. So, and those are all, they have like regional boundaries that could be modeled in a map.
Anything else anyone would like to add? This has been a really helpful conversation. I actually thought it worked really well, sort of keeping us all together and being able to cut across and jump between case studies and tools and resources and guidance all together. I think this was helpful. I think one thing that definitely, I think we should probably try to work with PG&E, Southern California Edison, and you guys to identify maybe some case studies, or also think about, I think your example, and Elena, about sort of the titles and being able to even just give the lay of the land to help guide, that everything doesn't have to be an exhaustive discussion, but just that a user would know to go and ask someone else about something. I think that's really helpful guidance, and I don't think something we've heard as much in other of our discussions, so that was great. You know, Greta or Sam, if you guys have other takeaways from today that you'd like to, okay. Well then with that, I guess I'd just like to thank everybody, and thanks, we didn't have, I assume, Susan, no questions that came in. But just encourage folks to be in touch with us. If you have more input, great idea strikes you on your way home, let us know. I think we may follow up as well as we're moving forward. So appreciate everybody's time and sharing your experience to help make this better. So thank you. Yeah, hi. No, thanks for your help. That was great.
Yeah. I think PG&E just wants a convening body. That's their main.
Yeah, and I talked a little bit, yeah, I mean, it seems like we should be able to help each other. You know, so.
Yeah, we just want to make sure we're not doing any other
Right, and so if you guys have a list that we can just say, we got all these things, and here's academic.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully it'll get longer, but right. Like I know we have like epic grants or something like that.
Right, we don't need those. Yeah. Well, and I think the ramp filing, when you're mentioning that, I've talked a little bit with Cliff and like others. I don't know, so that might be interesting.
I mean, it is. Every utility built their own model of how they were like measuring the safety. Right. Although there is stuff like there is metrics